to London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast.
And the public to today's meeting of the Transport Committee. Our main item of business today is a discussion on road-based driving and congestion. Please make sure that your electronic devices are switched off or to silent mode. And can I also ask guests to position their microphones so they can be heard clearly? Can I start by asking our clerk, Hannah Barlow, if any apologies have been received?
Thank you, Chair. No apologies received.
Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and ask if members have any other interest to declare? Can I ask the committee to confirm the minutes of the meeting of the committee held on the 23rd of October 2025 to be signed by me as a correct record? And can I ask the committee to note the completed and outstanding actions from its previous meetings and the additional correspondence received and sent? Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note the actions taken by me as group under delegated authority in consultation with party group lead members, namely to agree our letter to the Deputy Mayor for Transport regarding delays in processing taxi and private hire licences and our response to TfL's consultation on pedicabs? Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note, as more, the response from British Transport Police to our letter on response times to TfL call-outs, the response from TfL to our letter on the withdrawal of blue light status from the emergency response unit vehicles, the response from the Secretary of State for Transport to our letter on taxi and private hire vehicles, and the response from Heathrow Airport to our letter on Heathrow Airport expansion. Those. Thank you. We now move on to our main item of business, part 2 of our investigation into road space, driving and congestion. Today's discussion will be split into 2 panels. So I'd like to welcome our first panel of guests, and thank you for bearing with us through quite a lot of business there. So Natalie Chapman, who's Head of Public Affairs at Logistics UK. James Barwise, Policy Lead for Infrastructure at the Road Haulage Association, and Ian Wainwright, Director at Future City Logistics. So I'm going to ask a couple of initial questions and then we'll pass over to other members of the committee. So I'm going to first ask about specifically the increase in the number of parcels that are being delivered to homes. So we have data showing that that's exponentially increased in the last 10 years. Do you have a sense of what impact this has had on London's streets, and if the trend continues, what the longer term impact would be? Does anyone want to jump in? Thanks, Natalie.
Microphone, I'm happy to jump in. Thank you for inviting me to join you today. I think this is a really, really interesting subject. There has undoubtedly been a huge increase in online shopping over the last 10 years, really fuelled as well during the pandemic, and that hasn't gone away. What I'd start by saying is that congestion is a problem, it is a challenge, and there's lots of unintended consequences with congestion. But actually, lots of freight vehicles is a sign of a healthy economy as well, because we're not there, we don't put vehicles on the road for the sake of it. It's very expensive to run them. The margins for our sector are very tight, average 1% to 2%. So the vehicles are there because of demand. And we underpin every sector of the economy. So if you've got it, it was delivered on a truck or a van, increasingly maybe even now by a cargo bike or by other means. So we have seen some increases. What's interesting, though, I think particularly when we look at van traffic, is, and the challenge with van traffic as well, is we don't always know what's inside a van because quite often they're not liveried. And there's 2 different main uses for vans. One is as a delivery vehicle, and I think that's the one that we most associate with our day-to-day lives. The other is actually as effectively a mobile toolbox. So lots and lots of tradespeople using vans as well. And understanding kind of what that split is. There was a bit of research done quite a few years ago, which actually showed that the majority of the vans on the road were effectively mobile toolboxes. They were doing vehicles rather than carrying vehicles. That may have changed over the years. I haven't seen if there's any up-to-date evidence on that, but say it's quite difficult to collate evidence on exactly what those vehicles are doing specifically.
Thanks, that's really helpful, and we'll come back to the mobile toolboxes and servicing vehicles shortly. So, James, Ian?
Yeah, first of all, thanks.
Sorry, if you just press the little person and the red light goes on.
Testing,
Fantastic.
1, 2, 3. That would work, wouldn't it? Thank you so much for inviting me to be here today. James Barwise, Policy Lead at the Road Haulage Association. I think when it comes to freight trends in the capital, what we've seen is that since 1994, the number of billion vehicle miles for HGVs, first of all, that's actually remained fairly steady. Now, in terms of the amount of goods being shifted, that's fluctuated because volumes will change year in and year out. But as Natalie says, what we're noticing, the real increase there is in LGVs, and that's peaked at around 3.3 billion vehicle miles around 2019. Now, obviously, that's dipped post-pandemic, but we're starting to see an increase. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, this is actually quite a new phenomenon, and we're sort of responding, and by we, I mean we in the industry, and yourselves as decision makers at pace about, all of a sudden, this is a new way of getting goods round, and we have to come up with the answers pretty fast. As for HGVs, we do know that the number of goods is declining, moved by a HGV, I should say. So specifically from 2022 to 2023, there's been a gap of over double the average in other parts of the country. Now, I wouldn't necessarily put the two together and say that actually it's HGV out, LGV in. I think the problem is a lot more complicated, that there's different goods and different ways of getting them into the capital. But it's just worth reflecting at the top of this conversation that it's a very new problem, and we're having to think at pace to respond to it.
Thank you. Ian.
Thank you again for the invite. Interesting, having been sort of involved in London for, well, 20-odd years. There is a lot of change, and I think part of this is to try and remember that freight, what's carried is a derived demand. Vehicles are there because they're delivering something or they're taking something away. So there's definitely a shift, and even if you said the volume was the same, there's a fragmentation that's been going on. So rather than delivering to a high street, yes, there may be slightly fewer restaurants or shops on the high street as a result of just business changes, but effectively there's the same number of deliveries with less in them to the high street, and then that's being delivered to the home as well. So the efficiency for the operators is actually going down just by customer behaviour. So that gives operators a problem because it increases costs, and therefore that cost is going to end up on the customer, which is why, part of the whole thing about inflation and things, it's partly all this sort of, the more we want stuff individually, the less efficient that delivery actually is. If you go somewhere like Poland, 50% people are quite happy to go and get stuff from a parcel locker. In the UK, it's about 5%. It's the real difference culturally. So I think that's part of it. And part of it is, how do we enable the deliveries to be done in such a way that they can be as efficient as possible and then leave the streets clear as possible for people. And what we find is that there's an awful lot of streets, the high streets, the busy streets, central London, where the delivery window is between 7 a.m. and 11 a.m. Now, if you've got a vehicle, you've got that for 24 hours a day. If you've got a driver, that's probably an 8-hour shift. A 4-hour window is not very efficient. So we need to do something about when deliveries occur and how to get volume in. Go back 30 years, any M&S, Woolworths, whatever, they had a stockroom and it was upstairs. That doesn't exist anymore. So that space that's now, it's retail, it's residential, it's whatever, we need to work out how that space comes back into some of the centre as well, because that land use work is an issue. The routes that you take, the access at the curbside is an issue. All of these things come together. Rather than just thinking that particular vehicle may be a solution, we've got to look at the system on it.
Thanks. Yes, and we'll come back to a number of those subjects as we go along. Can I ask also specifically whether you have any comment on, and this is related really, the increase in online supermarket deliveries and the impact that that has specifically on congestion? Is there any specific aspects to that?
I think it probably extends it in the sense of it's putting, because more of those deliveries are going into residential areas, then clearly there's an added push there. But we know the biggest issue with congestion is school run. It's those times of the day. Apart from that they deliver to 11 o'clock at night, but actually, if Tesco's trying to deliver to a supermarket at 11 o'clock at night, there's probably a planning restriction that says they can't do it. So some of these things are a bit, the regulations went in at a time before we're doing some of this, and part of how things have evolved is the regulations don't keep up.
Thanks. That's really helpful.
In fact, sorry, if I can just add to that as well, Chair.
Apologies, sorry.
I don't think we've got necessarily specific data about supermarket deliveries. But the thing to remember is also that what would have been happening had that delivery not taken place. So how would that individual have got those products to their home? Would they have got in a car and taken it? So it's understanding kind of the bigger picture and the wider impact of has it taken out potentially car journeys instead and replaced it with fewer van journeys. Yes. Some of the challenge, of course, is about the efficiency of some of those deliveries when you choose your slot. But often, actually, the supermarkets are really good at doing this because they will offer discounted rates, perhaps even some free deliveries, if you pick your slots at certain times of day where either the roads are quieter or perhaps you've got a neighbour that's having a delivery at a similar time as well. So I think the supermarkets are trying to manage demand to an extent. But equally, if people aren't then travelling to a supermarket, perhaps it's because they're working from home, and you've got to think there's an economic value to what else they are doing with that time as well.
Yeah, it's a very complicated picture. Yes, thanks, Natalie. Assemblymember Bukhari.
Thank you. And just to follow on from this particular discussion, there's also an increase of delivery riders and drivers and using mopeds as well, of restaurant deliveries as well, and that impact that's having too. So how can all of this be better managed? What can we do?
I think that's a very good question. It has really changed. I mean, in terms of our membership, we don't quite go down to those individual gig economy courier cycle deliveries necessarily, but it's clearly a change in demand. It's retailers responding to that change in demand, and ultimately, if you look at it, it's all logistics, isn't it? Even if it's coming down to a courier on a moped or a motorbike, so they're responding to something, and I think ultimately we've got to look at how the demand for things. How are people being incentivised? And I gave that example of the supermarket deliveries. Actually, if there's ways in which you can positively incentivise people to kind of consolidate their deliveries, either because their neighbour's having a delivery at the same time, or, for example, Amazon, they do a delivery day. So it's very easy to go on and go, click and buy, and suddenly, it arrives tomorrow. But you can actually select a day. So if you're going to order multiple items and you don't need them straight away, which most of us don't in most cases, you can then have them all in one go. So I think there's some work to be done. It's not easy, but I think as us as consumers, we need to think about what we are doing, because it's very, very easy, isn't it? Just to sort of click, order something and it comes. And it's great. It's great. It's the modern world and it makes our lives much more convenient. But we do need to think about some of the wider potential consequences of some of that.
I think one of the things that's interesting, if you take a heavy goods vehicle, you'll have a driver who's got an additional licence, they've got additional training, they are statutorily required to do 35 hours training over a 5-year period. The companies that employ them will monitor what they do on the road through a tachograph that's in the vehicle. If you've got a van driver, they've probably got a car licence. Hopefully they've got some training, that the company's given them training, but effectively it could be, you've got a car licence, OK, I've checked the licence, there's the keys, get on with it. And you notice that sometimes in terms of the standards of behaviour of some of the van drivers. If you've got a rider on a food delivery app, and let's bear in mind, they are working as an individual on that app, and I don't necessarily criticise the individuals, but they're supplying their own bike. The standard of that bike, the speed it goes at, is probably down to them, and they're doing it because they're incentivised on the money. And the company is just raking the profit off the top. So there's no training. There's probably an online check to see whether they've had, quotes, any road safety training, whether they've understood the highway code, but it's probably a tick box. And I think part of this is how do we, if we want standards to be a certain way and we want road safety to be there for the rider as well as, the people around, I think some of that is how do we manage that? We've got to look at how that's regulated. People are making money out of people, and therefore how do you make money out of people? There ought to be things like insurance, maintenance, roadworthiness of the vehicles, those sorts of things. And I think that's if you take things like the Sustainable Urban Freight Association, who've done the cargo bikes, they're trying to professionalise that bit of the industry. Great. The trouble is, the food apps, you know, there's an added problem. You could get the same problem with a van driver.
Can I just add in on to that as well, because that's a really important point that Ian raised about operator licensing. So if you operate goods vehicles over 3.5 tonnes, you have to have an operator licence. The driver has to have different levels of qualifications, particularly driving above 7.5 tonnes. But even if you're van operators, if you're a van operator but you also have an operator licence because you operate HGVs, if there are issues with your van operation, that can impact on your operator licence. And the Traffic Commissioner, who's the judge and jury, the most important people of our sector, who have the ability to take action against an operator licence and ultimately revoke it in certain circumstances. That's why it's so important our members take compliance really, really seriously, because if they don't have an operator licence, they don't effectively have a business. So at the very top end of the larger vehicles, and say even into vans, the way in which they're being operated is very, very heavily regulated.
I think it's a really interesting question, and my take on it is going to be from more of a policy point of view. So prior to joining the RHA, I spent 10 years working for a county council in their transport policy teams, and across the country, local authorities are not very good at planning for freight. And the first reason is because they plan for this word, freight. Freight is an incredibly unhelpful term, and I think it's really reassuring to hear that question, because conversations like today, it's really clear that the needs of, say, a HGV driver delivering a huge part of a windmill down to the south of England has very different needs to someone delivering from Pizza Express or someone who's dropping off an Amazon package. The customer needs of all those deliveries are different, the logistics of getting the goods down is different, and the infrastructure we have to utilise. And each type of freight, if you will, needs serious consideration rather than just being put into some sort of umbrella term. And that takes time, and to some extent, there's been little to no guidance, I would say, from central government historically on how to plan for freight. It's something that the industry has just got on with, and for the most part successfully, but then there are bumps and issues such as congestion and other issues, which is why we're here talking about it. But no one has sort of deliberately planned this. So I think it's really reassuring to hear that decision makers are actually cottoning on to this and getting better and think, OK, how can we think about this in a more joined up and sophisticated way? And it's, it's an odd message to be saying here as a representative of road haulage freight in particular, saying I'm glad people are thinking about other modes, but the logic is, I'm sure my members will forgive me, but the logic is that we're actually starting to think about each sort of way of delivering goods in quite a bespoke way, and that's just something that hasn't really been thought about for a long time.
Thanks very much. Take your comment on calling it freight. I don't think transporting stuff was going to be a very catchy title, but if you do come up with something else, then we'd be glad to hear it. Assembly Member McCartney.
Thank you. If I can start with Natalie, and coming back to the information you gave us earlier about mobile toolboxes, and I think the data you were referring to was a Department of Transport survey in 2019-20 that said the most common usage of the van was actually for carrying tools and equipment. And given that, and they are really important service journeys in London, and I suspect a lot of those operators will be medium and small-sized businesses. Is there anything we can do, or any measures that should be introduced to increase the efficiency of those journeys?
And I think that's a good point. There was a report, and I forget the year of it. It was the RAC Foundation published it. And it's called The Implications of Online Shopping. And I caveat it because it was published before the pandemic, and things have kind of changed since then. But what that actually showed was the big difference between the two different types of van uses is about how many miles they therefore do. So if you've got a mobile toolbox, if we call it that, it will spend a lot of its time parked up nearby where the tools are needed. So it won't be doing generally the number of miles that perhaps a van that is making lots of deliveries will be doing. That said, also, particularly in certain areas of London, you'll be seeing vans that actually will be doing lots of multi-drop and may not be, they'll be doing a certain amount of mileage in, and once they're in, it's actually quite short, lots of quite short journeys. But the mileage is kind of different between the two, so I think they're different uses. And in terms of solutions, I guess if those vans aren't doing huge miles, they're parked up, so there's a question about the curbside space they're taking up, assuming they can't park off the road. So obviously that's a consideration. I'm not making a judgment on what necessarily should be done, but they need to be accommodated because, those vans are being used for a reason. If you're a plumber or an electrician and you're going to a job, you don't necessarily know what you're facing and what you're going to need. It's very difficult to probably carry all of your tools with you all the time on public transport. So, we need to have some understanding of how people are working, the hours that they're working, and and what's convenient.
Yeah, thank you, Ian.
You can talk about servicing and facilities management, that type of stuff. So the only place I know that's ever tried to do something specifically for this is actually in Sydney in Australia, and they call them tradies. So tradespeople, I suppose. But if you take the certain streets in central London, so if you take Warwick Street, which is to the east of Regent Street, you'll find it's basically, vans parked up for the day. Likewise, St Martin's Lane, which is interesting because WSP, the consultants who've just done some work for Westminster City Council, and there's some interesting data that's come out of that about how the street is used and what's delivered in the morning and where the vans and everything else is going in the afternoon. The problem is, as Natalie said, they've got to be able to get in. I think part of it is to get into central London, there's an added distance. In the Netherlands, they've done a lot of stuff on, because of the cargo bikes, they actually have some service engineers with cargo bikes. But you're still going to be able to park it somewhere. And I think the issue there is, the car parks that exist still within central London, it's very difficult once you're in there to actually get anything out of it. So somehow we need to facilitate this, and there needs to be some spaces that are sort of planned into the system, into the streetscape, usable for deliveries, as I say, potentially at different times of day, because it's not just that morning period, and then perhaps there's some space that's also available for the servicing people in the afternoon or whatever. But I think it's partly, they find a space to park, and then it's how much flexibility is given, by the civil enforcement officers and things, and what's allowed. So again, Westminster during the Olympics tried some stuff with traffic marshals. I think they still call them traffic marshals, but the practicalities of trying to help somebody find a space, as opposed to just enforce, is a different issue. So,
thank you. That's interesting. I think we should find out a bit more about that.
We're definitely here. I can hear some furious typing going on next to me, so that's really helpful. Thank you. Assembly Member Prince.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, panel. What do you feel the Mayor should do to better manage the impact of freight and service journeys on congestion in London? Do you want to kick off?
I was going to come in. So one of the biggest challenges, particularly for HGVs over 18 tonnes, and I will caveat it, it's not in necessarily the Mayor's gift, but it's something called the London Lorry Control Scheme. So what our sector will do is as I say, they're demand-driven, so they're delivering what their customers want when they want it. But there's another layer on top of that, and that is other restrictions, whether that's nighttime delivery restrictions, the London Lorry Control Scheme, which we can go into a little bit more, parking restrictions at different times. So quite often, we have our members are picking up millions of pounds a year in parking fines whilst making deliveries, because in many cases there's nowhere that they can stop to legally make that delivery. Or, for example, the restrictions say you've got 20 minutes. Well, you try unloading a supermarket truck in 20 minutes and safely, and loading on, using the tailgate, loading on the empty cages, just doesn't happen. The London Lorry Control Scheme, and I think this is something which we would really welcome support from committee members on. It's operated by London councils on behalf of the boroughs. It was introduced in 1985 primarily to address noise challenges of the movement of goods vehicles overnight and at weekends. So it kicks in the evening, 9 o'clock in the evening. It finishes at 7 o'clock in the morning. It operates on Saturday afternoons and Sundays. And it's not a ban. I think it was first called the London Lorry Ban. It's not technically a ban because you can use it, but you have to have a haulier permit. The vehicles have to be permitted. They then have to follow correct routing, which is making maximum use of the exempt route network, and minimum use of what are called the restricted roads, which are not just residential roads. It covers most of central London as restricted roads, but it's the roads that are deemed to be where more people live. So the idea is that trucks aren't going past them at night and at weekends. And what that leads to is some really significant extra mileage if you are operating at night and at weekends. And it also leads to many operators going, well, I'm just not going to come in till 7 o'clock in the morning. Exactly the same time that everyone else is trying to get to work, get the kids to school, where there's higher volumes of pedestrians and cyclists. The other factor that has changed significantly since it was introduced in 1985 is vehicle technology. The vehicles are markedly different. They are much, much quieter than they used to be. Okay, not all of them are silent, but we're starting to see some, very few of them, but we're starting to see some electric HGVs on the road, but even standard diesel HGVs are significantly quieter than the vehicles we saw in 1985. Yet the scheme has barely changed. There's been some tinkering with the routes. There was a plan for a big scheme review. I'm trying to think how many years ago. 7 or 8 years ago, I remember chairing an event with London councils over at the Oval with a room full of very angry hauliers who had sort of 30 years of pent-up frustration with this scheme. And I have to say, not a huge amount has massively changed. I think some of the back office systems and the online systems perhaps have improved slightly, but it's really bureaucratic. And if you get it wrong, and it's really complicated, it's a £550 fine for the haulier, plus a significant fine potentially for the driver as well. So it's a big barrier to retiming deliveries. And actually, where we've seen, I think Ian was saying, and James was saying, the number of HGVs has remained sort of fairly static over the last few years. There's lots of opportunity to move some of those deliveries to not necessarily the middle of the night, but the shoulders of the day. We did a huge amount of work on it in the London 2012 Olympics because we had to. We had a 6-hour delivery window in most places from midnight to 6 a.m. I worked very closely with Ian, who used to head up the freight team at TfL at the time, when we were looking at how we were going to get London to operate. And I know that the big concern at the time was, you know, will the pubs run out of beer? Will people be able to buy their newspapers, because people used to buy newspapers in 2012, and can I buy my pint of milk? And there was some real concern about how that would work. So there was a real concerted effort to shift deliveries, to change the way. So the London Lorry Control Scheme was, I think, a sort of relaxed enforcement. They didn't do away with the scheme entirely. And as far as I'm aware, there were no complaints about noise. So I think it's something that really needs some real strong political pressure to make sure that we can make those changes, because those are the additional mileage that's being done, that's putting additional vehicles on the road. For our members and our sector, it's additional cost that we all there's inherent transport costs in everything we buy. It's inflationary, but with those additional fuel that's used, that's emissions. And as I said, the safety challenges of funneling so much traffic to that morning peak period in particular.
So, what would be your 3 best asks if there was to be a review
of the scheme?
The London Lorry, whatever it is,
London Lorry Control
Scheme. Yeah. What would be your 3 biggest asks?
I think. We would like to see it go, but that may not happen. I think that's probably not one of the options. I think the 3 biggest is looking at the vehicles to which it applies. So it applies to goods vehicles over 18 tonnes. And there's a very simple reason, is because that's when you go from 2 to 3 axles, so it's just easy to enforce. And until recently, it was all enforced by people, in person. I think there may be some camera enforcement now, but it was done by people literally standing on street corners and looking at how many axles a vehicle had. So we know that there's lots of vehicles over 18 tonnes that are significantly quieter than those vehicles in 1985. So I think we need to look at the vehicles, and we need to look at the routing as well, because there's some really significant additional mileage. We did some survey work with our members earlier this year, and there were some quite scary stats that they came up with. So we had one major retailer. They ran 15 consecutive days of data for their distribution centres that serve the city, and they compared with the LLCS on and the LLCS, the London Lorry Control Scheme, off, and they noted that there were 2,332 additional miles being travelled per day to make provision for the London Lorry Control Scheme rules. 850,000 additional miles a year on London roads. That's one, albeit major, but one retailer. That equates to 290,000 extra litres of diesel each year. And from an environmental perspective, they've calculated the equivalent of around 750 tonnes of additional CO2 annually. And, of course, the associated NOx and particulate emissions as well with that. From a congestion perspective, that additional distance requires them to put 7 additional vehicles on the road each day, because they have a limited window to deliver stuff in. And so if they can't do it with the number of vehicles they've got, do you know what they do? They deal with the congestion problem by adding to it, by putting additional vehicles on the road. It doesn't make financial sense. It doesn't make environmental sense. It doesn't make sense in terms of road safety either. So that was one. And of course, the additional cost, setting aside the cost of purchasing and maintaining 7 additional HGVs, there's also, and the trailers as well, the payroll costs associated with the additional hours that they're having to get the drivers to do because they're having to go much longer routes is over 1.3 million a year. So, these are not insignificant costs. We've got other examples from other sectors as well, where they're having to add more vehicles on, do lots of additional mileage, change the way they're doing things, that I think in 2025 just doesn't make sense.
It's very comprehensive and some good points there, I think, Chair. Ian, do you want to kick?
I just wanted to add a follow-up on the London Lorry Control Scheme. It's in complete agreement with Natalie that I think if the conversation we're having today is about how do we manage most effectively the freight and goods vehicles that are accessing London's roads when there is significant competition for that highway space, then we have to be looking at the extent to which we allow those goods vehicles the time of day to access it. Now, what's key about the legislation is it is quite old and it's been a long time since it's been reviewed. The technology point is exactly right, because I still think you can maintain the integrity of the scheme in trying to preserve those noise pollution outcomes by just making a simple tweak. So your question was, what would be the one tweak I would make? It would be to say you keep the scheme, but it only prohibits vehicles of a certain decibel level from accessing it, which means that more modern and quiet vehicles can access those routes. And I don't think any of us are saying that you'd get a sort of seismic shift of hauliers suddenly rocking up at 3 in the morning, because a lot of hauliers won't want to do that, and a lot of customers won't want to be receiving their goods in the middle of the night. But even if it affects a 10% shift in the way that goods are currently going into sort of London central zones, it's an easy win for not much to spend on.
I'd take it back a stage, because the original question was about the congestion. And certainly the LLCS is perceived to be a problem for delivering overnight. Anything that reduces the 24 hours of the day, I think, is a problem. But what it does is it puts traffic onto certain routes. And effectively, bizarrely, some of the placemaking and stuff that's been going on in central London is doing the same thing. It's putting vehicles onto the same routes. If you look at somewhere like Chiswell Street in the City of London, if you look at somewhere like Beak Street coming out of Soho going onto Regent Street, if you go past those traffic lights, if you stood there as a pedestrian and just look, you find 2 or 3 vehicles get out of each set of lights. And vehicles can be trapped there for 20, 30 minutes trying to get through. Now, that's partly because the rest of the area has been made nicer, more pleasant, and all the rest of it. And what that space reduction and route reduction is doing, it's focusing people onto more of the same routes. So that's an issue in itself. But the space reduction on the curbside, or where you can deliver and how close you can deliver, is particularly important for things like brewery deliveries, beer deliveries. And if you take the Brewery Logistics Group, who are sort of the group of the main pub groups and things who actually deliver in London, since 2019, they've increased their number of vehicles by 20%. So rather than something like 550 delivering in London, they've got like 660. Now, partly, it's customers changing and ordering more frequently and smaller orders, and there's a whole series of different things in there, but part of it is they find less space at the curbside, they take longer to get there, they take longer to get out, they're less productive, they can do less drops per delivery, etc., and it's going the wrong way, if you like. So some of this is about how to design things. You know, new cycle lanes have gone in without a nice space for delivery to the pub. That causes a problem. They're all things that we should be doing, but we just need to do this and work it so that we actually blend this stuff together. The final quick one I'd add is land use. For the 2017-18 London plan, the original draft had a lot in there about land use, and it got struck out. So.
We do want to ask about that, but we're going to ask specifically about that. In fact, we're going to return to some of these subjects, so you might find us asking again because we want to talk about these in detail. Apologies for cutting you off, but yeah.
Would I be able to add a follow-up just on the original question of congestion?
You absolutely can,
So
yes.
I have a sort of spicy answer, and I have a very dry answer. Wow, that was in unison. OK. So it starts with a TfL document, Understanding and Managing Congestion Reports, produced for the GLA back in 2017, and it calls for the exploring of potential for freight-only lanes. Now, it may naturally seem very controversial to suggest that goods vehicles can be allowed access to lanes which currently are preserved for buses only or similar. But the question in front of us is, how are we managing the competing demand on the lorry network? Then surely that question has to come in front of us in terms of how can we make the most efficient use of the carriageway? Now, in TfL's sort of modal hierarchy, public transport is, I would say, rightly above freight, but freight is rightly above private car usage. And actually, is there a conversation to be had about allowing access to those lanes, even if it's just for a couple of hours a day, or on certain routes that we know to be busy freight corridors? So that is my slightly spicy answer. I will balance that with a dry answer, which is data. In preparation for today, I was refamiliarising myself with TfL's open source data, which for certain modes is very, very good, tube, bus, rail. But when it comes to freight, there isn't the same level of publicly available data. And that's because the data that TfL mostly has is on traffic counts, how many HGVs, LGVs pass through this traffic cordon. But that does not really tell you the story of freight, which, as we've already discussed, is incredibly complex. And I think what we would like to see is some serious survey commissioned work that actually looks at deliveries being made into London, that goes down into that level of granularity of, OK, where did this goods vehicle start its journey? Was it in Greater London? Was it in the North, the Midlands? What class of vehicle was it? If HGV, what tonnage? If an LGV, is it electric? What kind of goods is it taking? Could the operator have a choice to use a van rather than a truck? What route in London did it take? Because only when you have that sort of origin-destination data going into that granularity can you really understand freight movements into the capital. The advantage you have of that is once you get that data, you begin to really understand the freight corridors in the city. And then that informs the planning of, OK, we have these freight corridors. This is where we need to be really aggressive with the curbside management that Ian was talking about. We need to think about land for logistics, which we'll come on to, how that can maybe be appropriate sites for EV charging, whatever it might be. But until we have that data, boring and dry though it may be, we can't really sort of capture the narrative of freight moving around the capital and plan for it accordingly, I would argue.
So I've just got a supplementary. It's a good point you make, because people will choose to use vans rather than lorries, but actually using a lorry could be more efficient and so on, couldn't it, for many reasons? But that's not my question, but you can answer that question. Also, Ian's already touched on cycle lanes, but also the introduction of these LTNs, low traffic neighbourhoods where nobody can go in and out anywhere, and the 20-mile-per-hour speed limits. What impact, start with you, James, but anyone coming, do you think they've had on this industry?
As I said, the issue with the LTNs, and I know the view seems to be, in terms of the data that has been gathered, that it just the traffic flow is not a problem. I don't think, to be honest, I don't think that 20 miles an hour is a problem in most of London, because you could never do it in the first place. But I think it's this thing of actually, by forcing vehicles who very often have got this limited time window to get in and out, to use those few roads. I understand the benefits to the residents and potentially on the road safety within the zone. I think the issue comes on the edge of the zone. So I live in Lambeth, but sort of, if I'm going to the tube, Balham is the closest tube. If you go down the A24, you'll see cyclists weaving in and out all over the place, but it's almost a steady stream of freight vehicles down there at certain times because of the restrictions around. So what you find is just some of this stuff is probably intensifying where problems are likely to occur, poor air quality and all the rest of it. So I think some of it is just how these things work together. Some of the LTNs are great, some of them, but I think it's the principle of, as I say, the minute you've got some sort of super block, whether you've got it in central London for retail, it just this thing of forcing all the vehicles at the same time of day onto the same street.
Thank you for acknowledging the point on HGV and efficiency. Roughly, we know that to fill a fully laden 25-tonner takes approximately 30 vans. Now, I'm not saying that in any way to say, we should just use the HGV because it's the most efficient. For example, vans are decarbonising at a far faster pace than HGVs. They offer the flexibility that suits e-commerce really well. But it is worth noting that for a lot of operators, their business model is to move goods from A to B in as efficient way as possible. And that efficiently traditionally comes via the HGV. In terms of the points on 20 mile per hour, LTNs, I wouldn't want to go into any specific initiative because I think we'd get sidetracked, other than to say the whole business model of freight and logistics is about removing inefficiency from the supply chain. Once you do that, it adds up costs that either the operator has to absorb or pass on to the consumer. We know that 16% of the cost of running a truck currently is down to congestion. And that's down to low productivity and missed opportunities. So these things really do have tangible costs for the operator.
Yeah, and come back on the LTN point as well. So I think the challenge with those, some of the LTNs is more to do with the home deliveries and the multi-parcel drop deliveries rather than HGVs. But it is a good point because our members, some have, struggled when they've first been introduced, especially because a lot of them are being enforced by camera and it's not always obvious to see. They're not automatically always on routing and scheduling software. So again, the fines that then get picked up, cause a challenge in themselves. Our members do want to be compliant, but they also want to be efficient. And for some of those deliveries, you're going into an area, but then you have to go right back out and round to then go back in where you would have just gone from there to there. So it is a bit of a challenge. I think we can understand why they're being put in, and probably for those people that live within an LTN, it's probably made a huge improvement. but there's also a lot of people that live on the edge of LTNs, not in the LTNs, and I suspect they may have a slightly different view on the displaced traffic that they then see. So I think it's I'm not an expert on it. I think it's an interesting thing to look at because we see this even in rural areas where you've got a village that says, I want to ban HGVs. Well, OK, that's fine. So then it will just go to the next village and you just start to displace the problem, add additional mileage and potentially those unintended consequences. So it's something that has to be really carefully thought through on what the bigger picture and the bigger impact potentially is, as well as the benefits, in that specific local location.
Just one quick point. School streets, brilliant initiative, but again, they're very often not on the routing apps and things, and they're not always particularly well signposted away from the area. So if somebody's relying on their own sort of, knowledge of the route network, the problem that you get is you end up picking up a fine, or you suddenly end up in the edge of the school street area where there's a load of cars parked waiting to pick up kids. So some of this stuff is about how these things are enforced on a day-to-day basis.
Thanks very much. As members, we are, as is traditional in transport, running somewhat behind, just letting you all know that. Assembly Member Bakari.
Thank you, Chair. I want to go to the specific point of the Mayor of London and TfL having to reduce congestion, and that is a really important aim and something that I think I'm sure many of your members would also be keen to do, because we do have a need to meet net zero. So the congestion charge has been increased by £3, but there are businesses who were changing their vehicles to electric vans because of a discount of 100%, but that's been reduced to 50%. So is the same argument about these routes that you've been talking about, how that has been a change of route and congestion is going in certain areas because of the congestion charge, or are you seeing any change of behaviour or remodelling of businesses because of the congestion charge increase of £3?
I don't think we're seeing any change of behaviour. I think businesses are basically paying the additional costs, and that obviously means that, we as consumers then end up paying those additional costs because, as I said before, there's an inherent transport cost in everything we buy. Our sector is demand-driven, so if a delivery is demanded in a certain area, it may be that some of those, in some circumstances, that companies pass directly those costs on to customers. But I'm not aware that it has necessarily changed behaviour significantly. I don't know if there's any stats to sort of, since those changes have come into place, to show whether that has really significantly reduced traffic in specifically freight traffic.
When the congestion charge was first introduced, it reduced traffic in the congestion charge zone by 11%. The freight didn't budge an inch. Basically, there was a couple of operators who made their vehicles, from one depot to another, but they still had to deliver in the area. If you take the last Mayor's transport strategy, it was looking for a reduction of freight vans and HGVs in the congestion charge zone of 10%. I remember making up the number at the time. It's currently 22% lower. And that's, unfortunately, I would imagine, nothing to do with TfL. It's actually to do with just shopping behaviour and not as many people in central London as there was, and changes of online behaviour and all that. So I think part of this is the congestion feels worse, and probably the freight feels worse because it's probably displaced to more residential areas rather than the centre.
I think I would say that there's also a sort of high-level context here regarding it's quite a financially challenging time for the industry overall. We know in the last 2 financial years, around 1,000 hauliers have gone into administration. That's off the back of trends we've seen in the pandemic, and then a sort of perfect storm of costs arising from around 2022 onwards. What that means then is operators will be very blunt in deciding when to serve. If they've always served the capital and their whole business model is on serving the capital, they will continue to serve the capital even if there's been an increase in the congestion charge. Others who could just as easily serve the capital as serve another part of the country, a slight fluctuation in whether it's a charge or whether it's just something as simple as fuel duty or fuel costs going up, that might be enough for them to look at other markets. But it's one where operators are thinking very carefully about the markets they want to pursue.
Thanks, that's really helpful. And I'm going to Assembly Member Russell.
Thank you, Chair. And this section is about freight and congestion, so we've actually already kind of touched on quite a lot of it. I just wanted to do one quick follow-up on the LTN point, because if that is deliveries to people's homes, then do you think that the people doing the deliveries should actually be taking that into different kinds of vehicles? Because obviously cargo bikes and you can get little minivans that are powered by a bicycle and an e-bike. And do you think that actually there's not been quite enough shift in terms of the way that goods are being delivered to people's homes, given those kinds of changes that are happening on the roads?
I think one of the problems is, in nowhere does anybody, I don't think, there's very few customers who would specify which vehicle you've got to deliver it in. So if you're thinking about pure operational efficiency, you've got a mobile warehouse effectively. And therefore, if you've got a van and you can get, 180 drops on there, as opposed to a couple of trips with a cargo bike, then you're going to do it with a van because you've still got to employ one person to do it, and they haven't got to go back to a base somewhere. So where that base is actually incredibly important, because you've got to be able to reload the cargo bike. I think the other side of it is as well, if you take probably the biggest cargo bike operator that there was Zedify, who were employing people on full-term contracts and developing a vehicle. So part of the problem is, what are the people who are doing the deliveries? Do they have full-time employment? Have they got rights and everything else? And I think part of it is how we balance the economic and the social sustainability as well as the environmental sustainability of what's delivered. What would be an awful lot better is if people in those LTNs, like they used to take their post through the post box, actually went and picked stuff up from a parcel locker, and it wasn't delivered to their home. And therefore, what could then happen is one vehicle could go, fill up the parcel lockers and go out of the area, and then you've reduced the traffic, you've reduced the time, you've kept it efficient, you've kept it, cheaper, a whole series of things. So I think it's partly about people recognising that delivery to their front door is it shouldn't necessarily be a right, it should be seen as a luxury almost.
Interestingly, I think you're making the case for the post office to bring back its post office sorting offices, many of which have been closed.
Yeah. If you look after,
happily walked to pick up their parcels.
If you look after, over about 100 years, you go, so why haven't we got one nationalised? But anyway, it's one of those things that you just go, yeah, there's efficiencies there that could be given.
Okay, sorry, that was just picking up on that one particular point that had been made. So going back into the sort of actual questions, James, the Road Haulage Association report supplying our cities, which called for explicit urban freight corridors designed to serve HGVs, vans, coaches and buses. So that is partly presumably asking for bus lane access in London, but can you elaborate where those corridors, where you think those corridors should be and what would be needed to actually establish them?
Yes, so I think this is a refinement of the point I made earlier, that to some extent we need more data. We need that bigger picture of where HGV drivers moving. I mean, to some extent, we know this on a very high level, given the sort of big industrial sites around London. It's not a surprise that West London accounts for more jobs in the warehousing and storage sector, given Heathrow is there, for example. We know that 2 out of 5 vehicles on the M25 around Dartford is a HGV. But I think what our recommendations were calling for, just to clear the point, is not necessarily you have a north, south, east, west corridor and that is freight only, or it's absolutely vital that freight gains access to bus lanes, for example, but it's identifying where the peak areas of congestion are, where freight is competing for that road space, and actually then starting to think about, well, what does that look like? How do we manage it more efficiently? Is it something like, going back to the discussion on the London Lorry Control Scheme, is it on those routes where we might actually want to think about the times and the restrictions? Is it actually, we've not quite got into this yet, but do we want to sort of safeguard land in spatial plans that can be used for logistics hubs, which will help with, I'm sure we're going to talk a little bit about multimodal logistics, but there's lorry parking, there's charging for electric HGVs on those sites, and actually if you focus the investment on those corridors, it's actually far more supportive for freight than trying to do something as a blanket across the city. Does that make sense?
I don't want to tread on other people's questions, but this is I mean, it's been happening all morning. Yeah, I'm going to let, I don't know whose question is that. I'll let them pick up on that when we get to that point. Sorry, I'm being completely thrown off course now. I'd been listening carefully to what you were saying, and now I'm worrying about whose questions I'm
Don't worry, Assembly Member Russell. I think we're all accepting that this is just a wide-ranging and very interlinked conversation, which is exactly what Freight want us to do. So I think that's fine.
So yeah, without getting into the detail of the land issues, you're actually, what you're asking for is a kind of a mix of retiming of the noise restrictions. You're asking for some access to potentially bus lane corridors so that freight gets prioritised at high congestion times of day over private vehicles on the road, and you're thinking that sort of combination might actually help reduce the costs of haulage and therefore help bring down prices in the shops. So is that where you're going with this?
I think it's more to say, unfortunately for us and for this committee, there isn't a magic silver bullet that will solve the issue of freight, and therefore inevitably the answer to a lot of the issues around congestion and accessing the network have to come from a mixed approach. So whether it's the London Lorry Control Scheme, whether it's accessing freight-only lanes, whether it's looking at modal shift in some areas, re-looking at time of deliveries, then I think that is the best way to go, rather than adopting a sort of one-size-fits-all passage. But I'm very welcome to continue this further out in the break.
Moving on to think about curbside, which is something that has been mentioned already. I know there are various schemes. Some boroughs are thinking about virtual curbside with virtual parking bays available to be booked by businesses to make particular deliveries. So, yes, have you, from your, and maybe Ian, from your experience, sort of, because you were at TfL during the Olympics, weren't you? Sort of with all, and they did huge amounts of work, kind of communicating with Londoners about retiming public transport journeys, retiming deliveries. So, just in terms of making better use of curbside, what are there any things, Ian, from that experience that you'd like to suggest?
Yes. Yeah. So there was a retime, reroute, revised mode. There was 4 of them. And I can always, I get 4 is too many. There should be 3. I think one of the big issues, and it's interesting, I've done some freight awareness work with 3 of the subnational transport bodies around London. And what we found was there was a very limited understanding of actually how parking and how loading and unloading is controlled at the curbside. We all know about single and double yellow lines for parking, but the ones that are at right angles to the curb are actually single and double yellow, we used to call them blips, marks, for actual timing and whether it's timed or no loading and unloading. So very few transport planners seem to understand that in the basic. And one of the big issues is if you take a borough like Lambeth, where I live, in the centre at Waterloo, double yellow lines for parking, probably double yellow blips, particularly around the station. When you get to the south part of the borough, it's residential roads, which have got nothing. And I think one of the big issues is the understanding of that and what existing rules exist around loading and unloading need to be understood first before we necessarily jump to, let's digitise the curbside and have it all virtual. If you take a virtual loading bay, it will work for a beer delivery or a supermarket delivery, which takes 40 minutes, 50 minutes. It's not going to work for a van because nobody's going to book it to deliver 3 Amazon parcels. And then when you get to, the vans, sometimes they double park and all the rest of it. When you get to a cargo bay, they bump it on the pavement. Well, that's not right either, because a pavement should be for, people who've got mobility impairment and all the rest of it. So some of this is how the rules work, and we haven't quite got there. There is actually, within TfL Streetscape guidance, it's not been updated for many years, but it's actually very good at looking at how all of these things work together. But there is always an issue of the space because every street is different. So I think it's understanding the existing rules and regulations, maybe even some education with some of the drivers and the riders as to what they can and cannot do and what they shouldn't do. You can sometimes see that in the Amazon vans that are slightly bashed because they've done it wrong. But, so I think it's just how the rules work is first. The virtual will work in certain places at certain times, but I think it's a limited number of vehicles.
So for kind of like the regular massive Sainsbury's lorry that parks in a bus lane.
And things like beer delivery where you've got health and safety rules for both the driver and their mate, but also for the pedestrians and people that are around. You don't want a beer barrel, going miles down the road.
Okay. So, actually thinking, are you saying that there needs to be, that we need to think about that more in quite a basic way, but it needs to be thought about more than it is?
Yeah, definitely. And certainly in any new scheme design and all that type of stuff. And when, when they're putting a new bit of curbside in, is there a space? Very often what happens is you end up with like a loading bay where it's not needed because there was a space and the design engineer put it in rather than looking at the use and what's actually occurring across the curbside. The commodity that's being delivered and what those premises are used for becomes very important. That's the stuff that matters as to where the loading space is and isn't. Otherwise, it's the regulations.
I think, and if I can just add on to everything that Ian's just said, the other thing to consider as well is that if you look at high streets, they change over time. So you have banks that have turned into pubs that have turned into convenience stores, and their delivery demands are all going to be quite different. So what may have been absolutely appropriate for one particular street 10 years ago, actually it looks really different now. So a re-evaluation of just what those curbside demands are. Now that's challenging because it's resource intensive. But if we're seeing where you can perhaps do it, so if you look at what local authorities will have, what the boroughs will have, is stats on the PCNs that they're issuing. And if they're issuing lots of PCNs in a particular location, that's not a success, okay? Yeah. That is a sign of an issue, and we need to be looking at why. Why are those PCNs, why are there so many PCNs, why is there a hotspot in a particular area, and start to break into it. So perhaps you do it that way. But every delivery point needs a legal kind of access solution. There's got to be a solution. You can't just go, there's a supermarket and I'm sorry, there's no time of day or night that you can deliver there. Yeah. Well, the road, the street planning, the highway planning and the land use planning need to be working together to make sure that, if planning permission is granted, that there is a legal loading place at the same time.
Yeah, that's incredibly helpful, that sense that I hadn't thought about the way the high streets are changing so much and business those business needs for different buildings may shift over time, and actually that we need to be making sure we're allowing for that. So thank you very much.
Thanks. Assemblymember Garrett.
Thanks. It's been a big push in recent years towards sort of placemaking as an important part of highway engineering, and often the places that get created are, you know, really lovely places to go and to hang out and, you know, go to a pub. We've been talking about pubs quite a lot this morning. What I noticed, though, is that HGVs in particular, and even vans to some extent, never seem to appear in the artist's impressions that I see, you know, when these things come across my desk. And there's almost an attempt to wish away what is a fundamental part of the, you know, the mechanics of making this place work. Is it your experience, perhaps we'll start with you, James, is it your experience that actually the people designing these schemes often aren't thinking about the fact that, you know, I've seen these schemes proposed, and in fact in one case implemented in my constituency, on a major through road in and out of London. There was nowhere else that HGVs coming from Sussex and Surrey up into London could go. They were going to go along the A217 and the A23, and all the alternative routes are worse, but there was this, you know, kind of imaginary hobbit land of you know, HGV and large vehicle free. Is that an experience that you've had, and what are the, you know, have you had success at kind of speaking to those highways engineers and placemaking people to actually get them to take into account the fact that the whole thing doesn't work if you can't get goods in and out?
In a word, yes, that has been our experience. It's strange because we absolutely love the lorry. And we've just finished our National Lorry Week, in which that is often the tagline. But no, it's for various reasons, and we've touched on this already. I think there is a degree of what we call freight blindness, whether that's in engineering or whether it's in policy making. And actually, I think a lot of the work we're trying to do as a trade association is actually trying to get organisations to think not just on a basic level, how do you manage this in traffic management terms, but how, particularly for sort of larger organisations, how can you sort of unlock the economic potential that this has? So one of my favourite stats when it comes to logistics is it is an economic and job enabler. For every £1 of GVA added, it generates another £3 of GVA in a supporting sector. So that would sort of be, I realise I'm sort of going off topic here, but my message is that I think ultimately when we think about freight, and often it does come down to traffic management, but ultimately it's how do we manage it in such a way that also supports the industry. Obviously I would say that as a representative of the RHA, but more broadly, how do you support it because it offers that huge economic potential, particularly in a city like London.
Ian, have you had experience of this, thinking about, you know, maybe there are certain routes that just aren't appropriate for that kind of placemaking scheme?
Yeah, I mean, I think placemaking should be about the place, and it should include, you know, spaces for loading and unloading. You know, yes, we've all seen too many design things. I've seen them across, you know, European projects, North American projects, and all sorts. I think James mentioned freight blindness. As I say, I've been doing some work on freight awareness. We talked during that to people who are doing the planning, both transport and land use planning. We talked to the trade associations. We talked to Institute of Highways and Transport, Institute of Logistics and Transport. Nobody from the Royal Town Planning Institute would talk to us. We couldn't get hold of anybody there who actually wanted to talk about freight. And likewise, when trying to get into people like New London Architecture, we've struggled because it's not a sexy subject. You know, if you look at any architect's designs, the last thing they think about is where's the loading bay. You know, even if in one of the city blocks they're actually putting it underground or at the back, it's not the place that people want to be focused on. It's not where the glamour comes, and I think that's the problem partly.
I think there'd be a sudden collapse in glamour if there weren't any pints being delivered to the pubs that people were standing around hoping to drink on the lovely new street. Natalie, is there a way to kind of maybe not make it more exciting, but make it be more, you know, practical in thinking about these places, which, you know, visually look lovely, and as I say, when you look at the artist impression, there's never a van or a lorry there.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, placemaking is really important. We want our places to be lovelier places to be and spend time. And you're absolutely right that quite often freight needs aren't brought into that, and you've got that specific example. I'm going to give you a good example. So at the moment, obviously, quite a hot topic is Oxford Street, and we've been supporting the fact that the Mayoral Development Corporation will be overseeing the project, because we will deal with one management body. We need to make sure that freight is thought about from the beginning. There were plans about 7 or 8 years ago, Westminster City Council had their own plans to pedestrianise Oxford Street, or to certainly significantly change the way in which it worked and to really improve it. And my goodness, it really does need improving. There was some brilliant engagement work that was done. So before there were even plans of what it was going to look like and those wonderful artist impressions, they first looked at data. They looked at they looked at all the curbside activity, where deliveries are happening. They looked at noise issues and complaints. They then got down to where there perhaps were some specific issues. And actually one of the issues they noted was cash in transit. Because cash in transit, there are some very strict health and safety and security protocols that those operators have to abide by. And that means it restricts where they can stop. So they noticed that there were a couple of places that were potentially tricky. So they then engaged. We then put them in touch with a couple of the cash in transit operators. There's not a huge number of those companies. And so they engaged. They came up with plans. So before they even started to go to the consultation bit, that engagement happened before that. They looked at the data, they engaged, and then the plans, there was already industry buy-in to those plans. Doesn't mean everybody got what they'd wanted, but there's a buy-in, and it's bringing along that, and it's tapping into that expertise, because we don't expect local authorities to have all the expertise of what happens on their high street, but come and talk to us, and we can help influence and make sure that those plans work. So we deliver a really nice place, but that also actually works.
That sounds like a good example. Was that driven by, in that example you gave there of Oxford Street, was that driven by the local authority?
That was driven by Westminster City Council at the time. And there was one particular individual who did some really, really fantastic engagement with the industry. And obviously things have moved and those plans have changed. But now looking to what is the plans now for Oxford Street, we need to make sure that approach continues.
Do you know if the Mayor's been speaking, because obviously this is now a mayoral thing rather than a Westminster Council thing. Do you know if the Mayor's been doing that kind of sensible work that you've just described to make sure that Oxford Street actually works?
So I think it's at very early stages. I've got a colleague of mine who would be the person engaging with that. So, we need to make sure, and I would ask the committee to make sure that...
I can add to that, because there is a group called the Central London Freight Quality Partnership, which is the 7 Central London boroughs and some businesses, including the trade associations and things. There was a meeting a couple of weeks ago, and TfL presented sort of the high level of what they were doing. As Natalie said, there's been a couple of attempts looking at Oxford Street in the past. Certainly the second one, which had a lot more in it, and Westminster had already completed their freight servicing and action plan. TfL they're sort of on the ball about what they need to do for the front of the street. I think the issue is what's happening all the streets around and where traffic is potentially pushed to, including the freight traffic and the routes through. I think that will be some of the issues. But I think, yes, there is some engagement that started. More would always be welcome, I think, and including all boroughs with various schemes and things, where boroughs have developed their freight action plans of some sort, Camden, Westminster. There's a lot more understanding of where some of this stuff goes. Some others are not as close to that, I would suggest.
Okay, that sounds like something that we can certainly...
I think we'll have to... we can pick up.
I have another follow-up if we have time, Chair.
Yes, sure.
Oh, so another reason why your massive HGV won't be captured in that artist's impression is, dare I say, there is a net zero element here. If you're building new places, they obviously have sustainability goals, environmental concerns, and that is somewhat at odds with the traditional view of a HGV as a big diesel consuming beast. And And I can understand that now in the year of 2025, but there are signs, promising signs, that that transition to a greener fleet is happening. So we know that in 2023, there were 992 electric HGVs on the UK road network. That's gone up to 1,270 as of last year. So slowly by slowly, operators are finding the confidence to make that transition. We know it will be 10, 15 years until we see significant uptake because, and this is a whole separate conversation, the barriers to making that plunge are really quite significant. But we even know that those hauliers who they want to do something now but can't make the leap into purchasing electric trucks yet, we know that nearly half are currently looking into so-called low-carbon fuels, your HVO, your bioethanol, your biodiesel, so that they'll still be bringing trucks into, say, London, but they're trying to reduce the carbon emissions and make it a safer place for everyone. So while I don't think that truck will be appearing anytime soon on the artist impression, I would like to think by the time we get to 2040, it will, but perhaps with a little green refuelling station or an electric charging point on the side.
And just to add, we are at Logistics UK in a couple of weeks' time launching a new report of a plan into how to decarbonise road logistics, and we're also producing a low-carbon fuel plan as well. So we'll make sure the committee gets sight of those.
Please do. That would be really welcome. Is that all done?
Yeah, other than just to make the observation that if net zero means people can't get their deliveries, it isn't going to work. So diesel or not, the lorries still have got to get there with all their goods. But that was it from me.
I think they made that point now. Assembly Member Prince.
Thank you, Chair. I think, Natalie, you touched on the Olympic freight consolidation earlier. Is there still some freight consolidation centres in London? And also, what do you think are the key barriers to preventing the development of a larger network?
So for the Olympics, there was, for servicing London generally, the big push was on retiming. Deliveries into the park and venues were through because of obviously security restrictions, so that you delivered to effectively a consolidation centre that then did the onward delivery for that. So there's consolidation and there's consolidation centres. So there's lots of consolidation that happens within the supply chain. That's about efficiency. That's about the choice of the vehicles you use. We already touched on the different payloads you have between vans and HGVs. In terms of consolidation centres, the challenge there quite often is the business model and how they work. So we've seen over the years many that have been perhaps set up as an initiative by a local authority, and perhaps there's been some funding put into it. And when that funding's removed, it just doesn't continue. And I remember quite a disappointing one, I think, over in Norfolk, and basically the money was put into one guy who went round to engage with the industry, and I really felt for him. You know, that was not how it's going to work. Where we do see them work is generally in places where it's managed by the land or site owner. So, for example, if you deliver into Heathrow Airport, you know, as a retailer, you go to their consolidation centre, and you know that would be funded through what the retailers pay to Heathrow Airport to be on their site. So that's that. You know, the business model works. It's not an additional cost. It's just if you deliver there, that's the delivery point, and obviously for very obvious security screening. There was the example of 22 Bishopsgate. When that opened as well, huge development in the City of London. And I think the thought behind it as well was the modelling, when they worked out how many deliveries would be needed to service the many tenants on many floors of that building, like literally there was just no space. So a consolidation centre was put in place, and effectively your delivery point was somewhere else. And it was outside of the City of London, it was a shed somewhere, and then that was all brought in. And the way in which that funding model works, from what I understand, is that the tenants basically pay, it's part of their facility fee that they pay to the owner of the building, and that's just how it works. Where it's really a challenge, if you say, we've got a town centre and we want everything to go to a consolidation centre on that town centre, because how does the business model work? Who's going to pay for it? And if you do mandate it, I mean, say if there was a way of mandating it, also trying to think, you know, are there potential unintended consequences? So some retail deliveries will go in with a fully laden vehicle. And they'll go from A to B and they will deliver at that store in a fully laden vehicle. You kind of don't want it to go somewhere else, be taken off, put onto smaller vehicles, brought in. There's the additional cost, the additional mileage, is massive inefficiency. So I think sometimes consolidation centres have a real place, and sometimes they're a bit of a solution looking for a problem. I think we need to identify, well, what is the issue, and therefore what's the most appropriate solution for that issue, and does the business model stack up? You know, who's going to benefit from it, and where do the costs lie? And where they're misaligned, that's when we have a real challenge.
Yeah, I would agree with everything Natalie said there. I think consolidation centres are incredibly interesting from in a policy vacuum. The benefits they deliver are very easily understood, particularly when it comes to environmental outcomes. But it's like everything when it comes to freight and logistics, it's that word C, the commercial. How does this run, and what is a viable, sustainable operating model? So Assembly members may be aware of the Camden Consolidation Centre, based in Outer London. Deliveries were transferred to Camden Council offices, schools, libraries. It operated in 2 phases, the first in which it was run by an external provider, and a TfL assessment via a steer assessment essentially said this is not financially viable. And the quote here is, "There was low usage of the hub by private business despite it being located just outside a busy local centre." When it was then moved in-house and it had access to existing funding streams, and it sort of functioned more as a micro consolidation centre, it worked much more efficiently. But it's coming back to those first principles that the supply chain is about getting goods from A to B as efficiently as possible. The moment you introduce a middleman, inevitably there's delay and there is a cost associated with that. Just picking up on the point on the Olympics, one of the consolidation centres for the Olympic sites was specifically on construction, and that worked really well because essentially what you're saying is you have a company that is interested in getting as much aggregate metal construction materials in as possible. That's actually attractive to hauliers because you're saying to them, we need someone to supply us with as much in the way of building materials as possible, as efficiently as possible, and that's essentially a HGV operator's building model. Then on these sites they can be stored, redistributed, and the owning company of that consolidation centre has an interest in doing that because it furthers their wider aims around urban projects. So it can be done as long as it's efficient and there is that operating model, but outside of construction I think it is an area where more research needs to be done before we can be convinced.
And if I can just add, as I agree with James' point, that was a really good one actually on construction. I'd forgotten about that because that is an example where it does work very well. But again, it's making sure that building site, that new planning permissions, require, as part of their construction logistics plans of how they're going to be serviced, that there is a requirement to use a construction consolidation centre. And there's huge benefits actually to site operators because they're not having to store those products on site where there's perhaps space constraints. They can have things brought in at times that work for them. So it really helps them with their inventory management and waste, reducing waste as well.
I'll try and keep it brief. Effectively, logistics is maximised for logistics efficiency, not city efficiency, and that's the problem. So that what happens is you've got all these different commodities, different networks. It works for construction because you've got limited space. It works for Heathrow. It works for the Houses of Parliament because of security concerns. But that business model of who pays that difference, you've got to be able to get some added value out of the service. So Regent Street, I don't know whether theirs is still going or not, but Regent Street has had a consolidation model for some of the retailers because they're sort of high-end retailers. They're often coming in from abroad. It's their only UK outlet, and they can pre-retail stuff, which is sort of work that people like M&S do. They, stuff is delivered in bulk to a warehouse. It's basically put onto rails, so it's ready to go on the shop floor, and therefore there's no waste to come back out of the store. There's models that work in different supply chains. in London, one of the big issues is if we're trying to... Is it deconsolidation or consolidation? Because if you put stuff from lots of vans into one HGV, that will be consolidation in my mind, but most people sort of see consolidation centres as actually taking stuff out of big vehicles and putting it into smaller vehicles. So I think there's wording here we need to be thinking about. And the issue with any of those models is, where are those warehouses? And we come to the land use question again. Recently, the property market has tried developing a few. There's one on Nelson Mandela Way. There's one down on the A23 called Brixton Bloom. Looks very nice, but it's been up for 18 months and not one person's in it. And I'd imagine it's to do with the costs. So it's a model, it's a business model consolidation. That's the problem. It's not a policy solution as such.
Thank you. Assemblyman Botaro.
Good morning. I think it's morning still. Just about. So thank you. Thank you for your answers. We've touched upon it a lot and kind of darted around the subject, so I'm going to be the person that drew the land straw. So it's been reported that land available for logistics and industry in London has been shrunk by a quarter over the last 20 years. In your opinion, what should the Mayor do to take action to enhance and protect industrial land in London? If we start with Ian and come that way across the table.
As I started to say earlier, work has been done by the GLA over 16 or so years about land for transport functions, so bus stations as well as logistics. And I think some of that work's been really, really good. It's high quality. And what it's identified was the release of industrial land has been, as you say, it's been too much overall. One of the big issues in London is there's an imbalance of industrial land in the sense of more of it was in the east than the west. We've got the same with the safeguarded wharves. There's something like 8 to the west of the city, and the rest, there's about 40 down the other end of the Thames. So part of this is identifying what land is available, but it's also what are the premises on that land and whether people are insisting that new developments actually put some space in. There's been lots of locations where new housing development or apartments are being built, and there's this assumption of retail on the ground floor. Well, sorry, but I don't see that ever coming. So therefore, could we actually come up with designs where there's something a bit more practical? If you take in Paris, they've got what they call a logistics hotel, which is actually rail connected, warehousing below, housing above. So there's different models for it, but the principle has got to be is protect it, and in some way, safeguarding the sites for the wharves, safeguarding some rail-connected sites might be quite useful. We've got aggregates and such like that are delivered to places within London, but none of those are protected, and they're often in sort of triangles of where the railway lines go. So there's a lot that can be done to actually sort of unlock some of this, I think. But also it's what value the investors want from the premises, which needs to be thought about as well.
Yeah, just to add on to that, and just being sort of frank about the scale of the challenge, and I'm going to quote the London Freight and Servicing Plan here, which states the problem quite frankly. If freight operators need land and capacity for logistics in locations close to where goods and services need to be provided, if the available capacity is all allocated to other uses, such as housing, neighbourhoods cannot receive goods and services in the most efficient way possible. We know, as you say, that the amount of industrial land space available has shrunk by about 20 to 25% since 2001. The London plan does contain various welcome references to having that appetite for industrial floor space, but if it is not captured within site allocations, there's very little we can do. And again, I think this is something that many authorities, this is not just a London issue, this is a UK-wide issue. Authorities aren't really given particularly strong guidance on this from central government. The sector only received its first mention in the updated National Policy Planning Framework earlier this year, when it said that freight and logistics is absolutely vital. But I think the message to the committee today would be if there is a serious model about using land for logistics, whether that is going down the consolidation route, using it for other uses, it needs to be captured in the spatial plan, though there's obviously safeguarding that's very difficult.
Can I just add one thing? Sorry, Natalie. There was a draft supplementary planning guidance produced, I think, back in 2023. And there was some really good stuff in there as well about understanding. And I think part of it is to provide enough guidance that the boroughs feel comfortable and confident to be able to sort of, sign up some of these sites as well, I think. Because I think part of the problem is if you don't know enough about it, can you actually feel, yeah, I'm going to say it's logistics and not housing, and have enough reasons to justify against local councillors?
Yeah, and the current London plan, when it was in draft form, had a couple of really good policies in there about safeguarding industrial logistics land and no net loss of industrial logistics floor space. Now, we didn't go quite far enough because it talked about floor space, and we actually went land, and also it had some focus on plot ratios, which were a bit tight, because actually for logistics we need open yard space for vehicles as well. But there was some really good stuff that was in there. Unfortunately, despite us writing to the then Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government, he directed for that to be removed from the final plan, which was really disappointing. I can only think because there was an assumption that it was in competition with housing targets, that it was seen as an either-or. And actually, if we are going to, grow, if we're going to build more houses, we need to support those communities. Those people will demand things. The houses, whilst they're being built in the construction phases, but then, once people are there, where are the big sheds going to go? Where are the small sheds going to go? What are we going to do about how we service those new communities? It's not an either-or. So we were really, really disappointed. We've now got an opportunity, looking forward to the next London plan, to make sure that that happens. What I would urge, I think, Assembly members to do is to really engage with central government to ensure that they understand that, because the Secretary of State does have the power to put directions against policies that I think would have really helped London, and that was a real shame. So that would be my one urge.
Thank you. I'm going to throw some quick-fire one-word answer questions at you very quickly. So I'm going to start off with the use of planning powers to protect to protect and repurpose land for logistic. Is the Mayor using these powers sufficiently, in your opinion? Yes or no down the table?
Yes, but could do better. I think part of it is if the plan needs to include the words that there says the Mayor can then say that. Because they got removed before, the problem is, while the best intentions were there, I think that's the point.
Thank you.
Seconded.
Thirded, if that's the word. Right, agreed.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And then, as you mentioned, the London Plan, obviously the London Plan is about to go through a new version of it. I suppose it's you mentioned that the last one had some word that you were happy with. I suppose the question is, once again, yay or nay, whether you think that that needs to be enhanced, and then if you could write to us with any suggestions of enhancement if the answer is yes.
Yes, I think it could be enhanced. I actually wrote in for in the consultation for the things for the London Plan, because the other side of land use is that curbside space as well, because it's all part of the how you deliver supply chains is the whole route.
Yes, and happy to provide guidance and suggestions on that.
Yeah, absolutely the same. Yeah. There are certainly things that we'd ask for. The things that were in the draft plan last time, we'd like to see again, and there was obviously some enhancements we'd like to have seen in those draft policies. So we're happy to share those with you.
Thanks. We'd be really, really glad to receive additional detail. Assembly Member Moema.
Good morning, panel. My question is around waterborne freight and better or improved use of the river and canals in the city. So there was a report in 2025 that said that waterborne freight was underutilised, and I just wanted to know, as part of the UK's logistics network, how could that freight being shifted from the roads onto the river and those canals. Natalie, sorry.
I will start. Okay. I'll start because actually at Logistics UK, to qualify, our members are operators and buyers of transport across road, rail, sea and air, and include operators of light, of water freight as well, and also infrastructure providers, so ports and key ports and airports. So water freight is something that we are very interested in as part of the whole logistics system, and this is part of the challenge that we have. Is we probably all understand what a train, a plane, a boat, a truck, a van is, but how the system operates together. And there's definitely lots of potential, particularly in London. We've got a fantastic asset with the Thames and also the canal network, but particularly with the Thames, to do more. There is a fair amount that already is moved on the Thames, particularly lots of aggregates and waste. There's also some light freight that's moved. I know there's a DHL boat daily that goes that brings parcels that come into Heathrow and uses the Thames. I went on it in the summer. I highly recommend. It was a lovely trip down the river. It works for them because these are really high value, time sensitive parcels. And it gives a journey time reliability that the road network generally doesn't. It's then offloaded and put onto cargo bike for its onward delivery because it tends to be in a very sort of condensed areas to where it's then going to be delivered to. It's not a cheap solution. It works because it's a premium service that the customers are paying for. And this is the thing, when we look at parcels aren't all the same. There's things that we buy online that are perhaps lower value or we're not quite so, aren't quite so urgent. And there are really important documents that are crucial to business where people are willing to pay for a premium service. So it works in some scenarios really well. The challenge is not do we have enough river or do we have enough boats, because we do. The challenge is how we move stuff on and off. And I think Ian already touched on the wharves and piers and safeguarding of those. And again, that comes back to ensuring that we have the right provisions in the London plan and they are properly enforced to make sure that we do that. And then, as an organisation, we are working with our members, customers of freight, to really explore all of the opportunities. I know we may touch on rail freight later, but again, to look at where there's opportunity to shift from HGV to rail, where there's opportunity to shift to water, and getting over that initial hurdle for a part of this, a transport solution that a business hasn't used before tends to be the biggest challenge. Once they've started doing it, then they're in, but getting those customers on board can be the biggest challenge.
Okay. A couple of years ago, we had a visit. Some members went on a tour to look at precisely that issue, so the use of the river. And I think it was 2 years ago that some of us went. Yeah. And one of the things that was discussed was the lack of piers as you kind of go up the river, and then the capacity for removing parcels or deliveries from those. So in competition basically with maybe leisure piers or with people that were commuting. I wonder if you have thought about kind of discussions with those private owners of those piers, or how might we invest in the infrastructure, if you like, the equivalent of people using the pavement to put their cargo bike on. They're doing that on the pier when somebody's trying to get onto an Uber boat to get to work or something. What conversations, if any, or is that fantastical thinking?
No, it's not. And you make a really good point, because that is part of the challenge, because so many of those piers are privately owned. So it's not a case of us going to TfL, who operate all the piers, because they don't. So it is down to individual conversations, commercial arrangements. And also one of the other challenges around with safeguarding piers and wharves as well is about looking at redevelopment along the river. So, it's a lovely place to live. And if you live in a lovely multi-million-pound flat, do you really want to have all that freight going on around you? So that's one of the other considerations as well. Again, that it needs to sort of be delivered, I think, through the London plan. So I think there's planning considerations, and there's also those commercial conversations which are happening. There is a lot of work being done with that, and certainly within our membership, those conversations are happening.
Thank you. And Assemblymember Garrett. Yes.
Railways, Natalie. How much road freight could really be shifted off London's roads onto the railway, and what impact has the London Rail freight strategy had on achieving that?
So I think the biggest potential for London is not necessarily what's happening in central London. It's the vehicles that are travelling, particularly from ports around London, using the M25 to get onto wherever else they need to be, so from London Gateway. There is lots of potential for rail freight. I know that DP World and London Gateway are investing in rail freight. There's a rail freight terminal there. We also need to see some infrastructure investments that are nowhere near London. So Ely Junction, a long, long way from London, but actually that can unlock, quite a significant amount of capacity on the rail network for freight travelling up from the Port of Felixstowe and onto the Midlands, and it just means that they don't have to sort of travel through London. And also competing on those really busy commuter routes around London is another one of the big challenges as well. So a freight train can take up to 129 HGVs off the road. There's some real potential. There's some fantastic examples of where that is happening, and we've been putting on some events as well to try and demystify rail freight, to get new customers on board to look at rail freight as an option. It's quite often thought about as a good use for things like aggregates, but Tesco, for example, are a big user of rail freight. They have a big rail freight operation that they contract out, but that takes huge numbers of HGVs off the road, and is also when we talk about some of the challenges of decarbonising road transport, actually moving from road to rail where it works can also really help businesses in terms of their decarbonisation strategies as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks, Chair.
And that's all of our questions. And I'd just like to say, I think we probably could have done whole panels on any number of those subjects. So I would just like to acknowledge that. Thank you for giving probably only a fraction of your experience on these. Anything that you think we need to know or that you didn't get across, please do send us in. And just to say, I think that what we might have slightly missed is that obviously the level of detail and engagement and data that needed to solve this has really come across today. If you have any thoughts on specifically what TfL or government, we touched upon that, but anything else that they need to do in terms of data, engagement and resources, we'd be really, really welcome to hear that. But unfortunately, I don't have time to hear you now. So thanks very much. Thank you for all your contributions today. The committee will now take a short break of 5 minutes before we resume with our second panel. Thank you. Welcome back to today's Transport Committee meeting, where we're discussing road-based driving and congestion. Can I please welcome our second panel of guests, Fiona Cool, Senior Programme Manager at Cross River Partnership, Keith Doe, Director of Light Freight Logistics, Uber Boat by Thames Clipper, and Ben Knowles, the CEO of Pedal Me. Welcome, everyone. So I'm going to be kicking off with the first question, and then I'll hand over to other members of our committee. So, as online parcel, meal and supermarket deliveries continue to rise, which parts of London's freight network present the strongest opportunities to manage congestion through modes such as cargo bikes, electric vehicles, river freight or rail? I'm going to throw it open. Who would like to jump in?
Right. Hi everyone, thank you very much for having me. So I think this builds on really nicely obviously from the previous panel, but I think a huge opportunity is actually the middle mile. For example, we have some really good opportunities for both river freight but also rail freight directly into sort of areas of real strategic importance in central London, that then you can actually use these sustainable low emission modes to do deliveries from those sort of central London points. So I think that that's a really big opportunity because, as we've already kind of discussed, there's obviously we're wanting to remove the larger vehicles from coming into the really congestion points within central London. And at the moment, we have these opportunities that aren't really competitive, and more could be done to make them competitive with roads so that we can then be improving things like road safety, congestion. It's a public health opportunity as well. And I think it's that middle mile that, in my opinion, provides probably the most opportunity to do that. Yeah.
Thank you.
I mean, I'm going to certainly agree about the middle mile element because that's what we're building at the moment in regards to the electric freight boat that will be carrying freight from Dartford into central London for delivery on electric vehicles for the final mile. But it's that middle leg that we're going to be introducing. It's effectively putting back to the river the industry that was removed probably 40, 50 years ago, and it's trying to reopen wharfs and locations along the Thames that we're able to get that freight from the river onto the roadside for that final mile. And that's where the challenge comes, because obviously the river is an underutilised motorway in the central London that we're going to take advantage of. But it is that interaction between river and road which is the challenge from our point of view. And then having that the kind of a joined up thinking approach about land ownership, especially if we're talking about electric boats, how we're going to get the power down to shoreside so we can actually charge the boat and it can actually do full end-to-end journeys with carbon free energy. So that's the challenge for us, but absolutely the middle mile, bringing that freight in, removing the HGVs off the road, it's not just only better for the environment and everything else, but it's better for the companies that we're working with, our future clients, reducing their time, reducing their cost and increasing their efficiency. So it works very well. And then we partner with the likes of Pedal Me for that final mile element.
Thanks.
Hi.
Apologies, just pop your mic on. That's the one. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I'm Ben Knowles, I'm CEO of Pedal Me, and I'm going to make the case for the last mile being the most important part, perhaps unsurprisingly. So the last mile is something like about 70% of all mileage in logistics is this last mile component. And what we have happening in London at the minute is we have lots of vans being driven around. For me, every van on the road that you see is a market failure, because those van trips could all be done in London by cargo bike, pretty much. So most of those vans are not running full. The average occupancy is something like a third, 25% on average. Cargo bikes can carry 25 to 30% of a van load, at least under a model in which people are fully employed, fully trained, have appropriate equipment, which I appreciate is maybe not the majority of what you're seeing for cycle logistics. But Pedal Me, we're a bit different. We employ people properly, we spend a lot of time training people properly, and that means we can do things like recover 30 empty beer barrels at a time, or we can deliver 5 times 25 kilo restaurant supply drops on one bike, or we can take 80 drops, home delivery drops, which is the amount that you need to make those deliveries not need resupply. So we're operating much more efficiently and at much bigger scale, and I'd love to see cargo bikes being able to fulfil their potential in supporting London, in reducing congestion, and reducing those unnecessary van trips, which make up so much of London's traffic.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Next question is Assembly Member McCartney.
Thank you. We'll be coming back to a lot of that shortly. But I want to ask particularly about the Waterloo Freight Hub trial. And I understand that it's started in March of this year with this massive underused space at Waterloo Station. And does anybody have any inkling how it's going?
Yes. So essentially, maybe to give a little bit of context, so the Waterloo Freight Trial, that was something that CRP basically funded. We basically used an underutilised space that is underneath Waterloo Station. We did some infrastructure improvements to make it more suitable for a last-mile courier to actually operate from that space. And what we basically did was it acted as a micro-consolidation hub with goods coming in by van and then going out by electric-assisted cargo bikes. What was really beneficial about that was it allowed us to prove that that sort of operation can happen within a very sort of a station environment that we have to look into a lot of different things like fire safety, health and safety regulations, how it can be supported in obviously an area where we have lots of foot through people who are using the rail passenger rail services. In terms of how it's gone, so it was a very short trial, and as I said, it was mainly focused on proving that it could work as a logistics space. Essentially, I have some notes here. So we delivered, let me just find it. This is where I've got all the notes that I need to remember. So essentially, it did result in really good emission savings, 92% for NOx, 96% for CO2, and about 78 for PM 2.5. What was, I guess, quite interesting about the opportunity is it has a straight platform to this space access, so it has a ramp. And what we're now trying to do, now that we've proved that a logistics operation can happen in that space, we want to now bring in rail freight to prove that there is the ability to actually transfer goods from rail to the cargo bikes in this space. We have done a lot of capacity planning, so we know it is possible. There are rail routes that will come into Waterloo from, for example, the Midlands. And we're in that process now of trying to do some fundraising to actually enable a freight service to come in so that we can then do an operation including the rail freight element. So in terms of how it's going, it went really well in that we proved that it can operate as a space in that underutilised area. What we're now struggling with a little bit is how we actually get the funding for the actual train itself to be used and then prove that the rail freight element is going to work. So we've been working quite closely with Network Rail, and we have got sort of some plans for a trial that are currently going sort of through the Network Rail's kind of processes, and we're hoping that there will be a trial starting in sort of the new year. Unfortunately, we're not able to fund that, so we've sort of passed that on to Network Rail as the next stage of the process. So it's sort of in development. But I think the key thing is highlighting that that space underneath the station can be used for logistics purposes. It won't interfere with the actual passenger side of things. And now it's just finding the investment to bring in a rail freight train. And when I say a rail freight train, we're actually looking at a passenger train that has been converted to allow express rail freight to be delivered into the station. So that's where we're at. It's quite a long process, as you can imagine. So yeah, we'll obviously keep you updated as that progresses, and hopefully there will be a lot of monitoring associated with that as well.
I mean, so what I've learned from that is a bit what the previous panel said. There are always funding challenges and who pays for this. But it's also to me that there perhaps is some underused land in central London in particular, or elsewhere, that we don't necessarily think about using.
Exactly. And I think if it also kind of relating to that is actually in terms of that infrastructure as well, because we were able to apply some funding to make it a space that could operate for logistics. But in reality, to get it to a scalable, impactful level, a lot more infrastructure improvements will be needed. You know, the space is not really, even with the funding we've put in, the nicest working condition for the sector. And it's a big question about who are we expecting to pay for that. For example, does the operator who's going to operate from that space put in that upfront cost, which would be very hard for a lot of the couriers that we're trying to approach, for example, the low emission last mile couriers, that's just not really an option. But then the difficulty is if you get some of the bigger players like the Amazons, Everys, who might invest in this space, then they're going to only be using it for their own purposes. So it's not then having the strategic impact we would want it to. So then there's this whole idea of should there be, for example, the actual station that should be providing this infrastructure. So it's a really difficult kind of barrier, because if we're wanting it to be of the strategic and sort of sustainability, importance that it could be, we really want it to be available to be used by multiple different operators, and that's just not going to happen if they're expected to put the money in to enable them to use that space. So yeah, it's a challenge, but
so the commerciality might let
yes,
the exactly. Business case. Yeah, I mean the other thing that was quite clear from this trial is that it worked because that last mile was either by cargo bike or electric vehicle. So I'm assuming that would have to be the conditions for anything like this to work. So I'm going to come to you, Ben, as well. I mean, that is right, isn't it? And secondly, could this model operate throughout our city, or is it particularly in very concentrated pockets of population, such as in central London? Ben, do you want to?
So we operate across a 19-kilometre radius of London. So that's like Bexley Heath, it's far end of Enfield, it's Kingston. Cargo bikes can compete across a large area, but it depends a lot on the policy context. So, for example, in East London, we have really big challenges because there are motor crossings that we can't access, the Blackwall Tunnel. So from here, for example, for us to deliver over to Greenwich, for us, that's a 40-minute journey. For a motor vehicle, it's an 8-minute journey. And although we are faster and more efficient, there are examples like that in the outskirts of London all over the place, where the framework that we're operating in is pulling against us and making it almost impossible for us to compete for some of those trips.
I'm going to come up, there's a question later on about some of your barriers and what you could do to overcome them.
Yeah.
But my point about the areas in which you can operate, you seem to be saying it's the breadth of London.
For the type of sort of last mile logistics that we're talking about here, I think, yes, it's fair to say the majority of London. And, that's what, if you look at how Amazon are operating, for example, with their cargo bike operations, that's not just in the centre, that's out in NW10, it's in areas that are very far from the centre, and cargo bikes can still provide competitive advantages in those contexts as long as the infrastructure framework is right. So things like low traffic no heads, for example, are strongly preferential towards cargo bikes and help level the playing field against the sort of historic advantage given to motor vehicles by our infrastructure.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Assembly Member Russell.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, everyone. So one of the things that we were talking about in the earlier panel was managing curbside space and the competing interests for activity at the curbside, whether it's charging vehicles, parking vehicles, doing deliveries, and some of the kind of stuff that we saw a lot of during the pandemic, kind of actually making space available for restaurant chairs and tables and things like that in some parking bays. So it's like that curbside space, particularly in congested inner London areas, is sort of really much in demand. And so I just wonder, yes, the sort of question, and I'll start with you, Ben, is what curbside management measures are needed in London if we're going to ensure efficient deliveries and also minimising any impacts on worsening congestion and kind of, you know, the sort of the big traffic levels.
Sure. From a cargo bike perspective, it's relatively straightforward for us to park our standard vehicles, our standard cargo bikes. It's more difficult when they have trailers, but that's generally not too much of a barrier to us. What's more of a barrier is sort of illegal parking and areas where there's very high density of parking along the curb, which doesn't allow us to space to pause and unload. And, you know, there are areas in the outskirts of London where there's sort of parking down both sides. And I think there's a lot of advantage that can be gained in terms of modal shift by tackling the amount of parking that's available, because I know from my background as a transport planner that a key driver of more driving is availability of parking. The easier you make it for people to park, the more people drive. And almost certainly the same is true with motor vehicle logistics. If we make it easier for people to drop off quickly using vans, that minimises the economic disadvantage of that activity. Anything we can do to reduce the number of motor vehicle movements in London in line with the Mayor's transport strategy is likely to better the city, reduce congestion, but also improve air quality and all those other good things that come with less motor vehicle movements.
So is that a case for across London trying to manage that curbside parking? I mean, you know, we heard a bit about, you know, the sort of double yellow lines and then the kind of little lines on the vertical lines on the curb. And I think it was Ian was saying that actually we need to be a lot sharper about how those get used to actually make sure that the space is used effectively. Have you got any kind of asks on that score in terms of how that space is managed?
Sure. I mean, I think that there is a really strong case for reducing the amount of parking across London, because a huge amount of space in London is given over to car parking, which could be used for public amenities, for chairs and tables to enable commerce. And it would be great to see a wider policy looking at reducing the number of car parking spaces in line with the reduction in driving that's happening in London over time. I think that would help accelerate that change, and that would benefit us as a business, but in a relatively small way, but would definitely improve the city.
Okay, thank
Can
you.
I just come in on
Yes,
this one?
Fiona.
So yeah, I think what was a really interesting trial that we did at Crossroad Partnership, we actually did a curbside management trial. I think it sort of builds on some of the points that were mentioned in the previous panel about where there are use cases that can really benefit dynamic use of the curbside. So essentially what we did was we helped different local authorities to trial these virtual loading bays in specific use cases across sort of London. So for example, we approached in City of London, an area where a pub was really struggling with their deliveries. In Lambeth, for example, we actually supported a theatre company that required a lot of time to be able to do their deliveries. And it actually, what was really interesting about that use case was it interacted with a traffic filter. So it actually allowed access through the traffic filter if they booked this bay that was the virtual loading bay. And similarly, in some pedestrianised areas where deliveries were struggling to happen because of pedestrianisation, we used these virtual loading bays. And what was very interesting was that a big kind of key aim of it was to prevent the rerouting of deliveries, to prevent missed deliveries. And we actually resulted in the trial, if it had been done for a year, just with these 8 virtual loading bays, we predicted that we would have saved 636 kilometres of vehicle circulation. So that's a kind of improving congestion and traffic, but there's also that efficiency element that we touched on in the previous panel. So I think there's a really key opportunity to be able to use the curbside in slightly more dynamic ways, to appreciate that it needs to be used differently for different scenarios, and through having a, virtual loading or booking system like that, it could, for example, allow exemptions for certain industries, like the brewery logistics that we've heard about, that needs to be very close to their drop-off destination and has much stricter health and safety rules. So I think there is an element of kind of flexibility that could be applied, that it's not just a one-fits-all restriction. We do need to look at use cases and that particular area itself. But then I think there's an additional sort of barrier in the sense that, yes, it was brilliant that we used this virtual loading bay platform provided by Grid Smarter Cities. We had to do a lot of engagement to get the actual couriers to onboard onto that platform to then be able to book the slots. So then there's that piece around, well, if we're going to have, let's say, virtual loading bays used in multiple boroughs and they all use different operators of virtual loading bays, we're then creating another problem that the couriers have to go, right, I'm in this area, I need to use this app, I'm in this area, I need to use this app, and that in itself provides a lot more, problems for them. It's not efficient, and then it just results in people getting disengaged and not wanting to actually use the virtual loading bay itself. So I think there does need to be some more strategic planning in terms of how we might manage the curbside, and it always needs to be in a way that is useful for the actual end user, rather than, okay, through my procurement exercise, we chose this operator versus this operator, because it's all well and good, but unfortunately logistics doesn't just stay within borough boundaries.
Yeah, so possibly a role for TfL to take
Exactly.
that pan-London approach so that it's unified. Keith, did you want to?
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, from our point of view, our curbside is slightly different to Ben's, but one of the challenges that we have is actually having access to the piers through private land, and that being freed up. So obviously we can operate at certain piers, not all piers, depending on how they are set up and the brow that they have, and the steepness of the brow at low tide restricts whether we can use that. So there's only a finite number that we can operate from, and some of them go onto private land, and the private land owners will turn around and say, you can't have cargo bikes coming across our land, and therefore we can't connect up that pier very easily to the river, from the river onto the roadside. And so there's going to have to be some support in regards to changing controls there, because ultimately we can't be pushing cages 100 metres along private land to the roadside to offload items onto cargo bikes and to go on their final journey, because it's just, the security just wouldn't work, and time-wise it's just completely inefficient. So
Is it possible to, because I understood that once those wharves were all sold off, and they all got sold in the 80s and 90s for housing developments, and no one safeguarded the routes to the river, is it possible to unpick those land deals that were done in the past?
Absolutely. So, a lot of redevelopment that's going on now along the river, they are safeguarded, protected wharves, and therefore they need to have a freight box associated with the development. There's a couple that we're involved with as an organisation, which is fantastic. But also, it's just the normal passenger piers that are being utilised by our passenger boats each day, using those locations. But it is that interaction between the river and the road network, which is the challenge. And lots of conversations with TfL and City of London, which are very supportive and support the initiative that we're trying to deliver here. But it's, another point is, if we're bringing freight in, significant number of, a volume of freight in from outside of central London, then there has to be vehicles here to accept that freight. So for our clients, for example, they need to find locations where they can charge overnight and store their cargo bikes so that they're ready for the next day operation. It's not as if they're coming to a central hub or point within London where they're already based for sortation and they go off from there. So again, there's underground car parks which are underutilised. Talk about the car parking. Many of the office blocks in central London, the car parks are massively underutilised, and we're talking to the owners of that land to utilise that space. But more needs to be done to free up the private land ownership to allow us to use and get cargo bikes along the river
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks. We're just members. We're just rejigging the questions slightly, so don't be shocked if they're not in the order you expect. Assembly Member Bukhari.
Thank you. So I'm going to dig in to the cargo bike question as well, and we've heard a lot about the support that cargo bikes provide for sustainable last mile deliveries, and TfL produced a cargo bike strategy. I was at the Cargo Bike Summit, which was the first, and that was, a really big way of pushing the need for cargo bikes to be supported. But has there been that support? Have you seen a shift of support from TfL since the strategy? Fiona and Ben, what do you think?
I think there's definitely been support from, and I guess this is where I should clarify, we aren't a last mile operator. We just do schemes that aim to support last mile operators and sustainable freight. But I definitely think there's more awareness now, which is brilliant. And I think there's definitely an understanding from organisations that are requiring courier services that cargo bikes play a really important role. I think there are still questions around things like regulations and, like, for example, training. And I definitely think there's probably different standards across different couriers that could have a little bit more support to get them to a sort of similar level. But from our perspective, I think the TfL message that cargo bikes are, supported is definitely become more aware that cargo bikes are a really good opportunity, and businesses are looking at using them a lot more. But that's from our kind of, working with businesses who want to be sustainable angle, not a courier ourselves.
I think the policy and the strategy has been helpful overall in terms of getting the messaging out. I guess I have to admit on our side that maybe we've not been speaking to TfL as much as we could have been. We've been growing very, very fast, and so we've been very focused on tackling scaling challenges as we increase revenues by 60% year on year. But TfL have always been very supportive, and they're also setting out the overall framework in which we're operating in. And there's been some really good progress in general terms, in terms of supporting people using bikes to get around, and that benefits our staff and benefits our operations. So, if you look at the east-west cycle superhighway, for example, between kind of, if you go between like Southwark Bridge and down to Parliament, that trying to go along there in the road, that was like 25 minutes. And now the cycle infrastructure route is more like 13 or 14 minutes along that length. And that helps to help us balance out some of the other wider employment issues that are kind of holding back cargo bike development, primarily the sort of gig economy, sub-legal working, and all of that being a lot cheaper. If you don't pay tax and you don't pay staff properly because they're not employees, allegedly, then it's cheaper, and that offsets the fact that cargo bikes are much, much more efficient. They're inherently a much more efficient way of doing business, especially if you have trained staff that know what they're doing. And it's difficult for TfL to intervene there, and that is in my view, that is far and away the biggest break on development of cargo bikes as a mode of delivery, because if you're going to get the full benefit of using cargo bikes, then you need employees, because you need to provide them with training, at least to a basic level. And if you want to use vans, mopeds, you can just get people off the shelf, and therefore you can use the gig economy, and it's being tolerated in our law for now, even if it's often not really in line with our legal framework. And I'm hopeful that the Fair Work Agency and other changes that are coming are really going to have a big impact on this sector, but it's difficult for a TfL to intervene in those really big policy challenges that are more set at a national level.
I know that Pedal Me's really been pushing that kind of professionalisation of cargo bikes. And as you're probably well aware, Ben, we had your colleague Chris Dixon, who was here for the Economy Committee meeting, that we held on trying to push businesses, encourage businesses to shift to using cargo bikes. And there was some clear recommendations from that report of how we can incentivise businesses. Do you think that there's still some progress to be made in that shift for businesses to be incentivised to make that switch to using cargo bikes, not just by just using Pedal Me, but using their own even to start adapting their businesses? Is there enough happening, or is there more that we can do?
I'd just go back to that wider framework and kind of providing infrastructure which is supportive to use of cargo bikes, cycle superhighways, low traffic neighbourhoods. I think there's lots that can be done on sort of like a behaviour change side with messaging and providing training programs and the like, but there's a limited amount of traction that's going to get while the overall framework is pushing in the main back towards van logistics because of the sort of tax advantages of the gig economy and sublegal working. I think the things that TfL can influence, it's mainly the road network is far and away the biggest tool that TfL has to change how people are using the network, because if you make it easier for people to do things, they're more likely to do them. And there are really strong non-linear impacts in commercial operations, because if you reach the tipping point where it's not just like a small, highly trained elite of riders as we have that can outcompete motor vehicles by a significant margin, but if you push the point to which there's more like a more level competitive framework, there's more equal treatment of van logistics and cargo bikes, and the infrastructure is equally set up for cargo bikes as it is for motor vehicles, then you'll see a very fast shift away from using motor vehicles, because cargo bikes are inherently a lot more efficient. Even, operated by highly trained people, they are far and away more efficient, 60% more efficient, say, the University of Westminster. What I've been hearing in the background from large logistics agencies that we have open channels with and have discussions with, they're finding typically 25 to 30% more efficient than van logistics using contractors in four-wheeled vehicles. So less efficient than two-wheeled vehicles with highly trained people, but still more efficient than vans. And it's just about trying to level that playing field just a little bit will make a really, really big difference.
And there is evidence to say that from, for example, Clean Cities campaign saying that cargo bike use has been doubled from 2022 to 2024. We just need the infrastructure to go at the speed of the use of the cargo bikes themselves. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks. Assemblymember Russell.
Thank you. Yes, I just wanted to pick up on the sort of the regulation, the employment side of things, because Pedal Me is known for being a proper, very good employer that trains its workers, and so on the road, if you're cycling and you're overtaken by a Pedal Me bike, it is being ridden by someone who is really thoughtful about the people around them, and you don't feel at risk at all. So I'm just wondering if, the sort of the big freight, the kind of big lorries are controlled by, there's lots of regulation around the use of big lorries and freight in London. Do you think it would actually be helpful to have more regulation around cargo bike businesses, so that there is an expectation, and that you could potentially lose your cargo bike operator license if your riders were not well trained and properly paid, and the sort of basic, because when you look at some of the people riding around for the gig economy, they're riding on bikes that aren't necessarily well maintained. There's kind of lots of safety implications of having a lot of people, particularly on e-assist bikes, who are not well trained, and particularly e-assist bikes that are carrying some cargo, so they've got a bit of weight. And so, do you think that having some kind of operator licence process within London for cargo bikes would be helpful?
I would say that it makes sense to start with the vehicles with the greatest potential for harm. So I'd really like to see vans being much better regulated, because vans capable of 100 miles an hour in a city environment and weighing a couple of tons, I mean, there's much more risk associated with poorly driven vans than there will ever be from even a terribly ridden cargo bike. And I think it's a very broad problem here that doesn't, yes, sure, there are problems with inconsiderate riding. I think that almost always, as when we look at pedicabs, as when we look at white van drivers, as when we look at a variety of driving levels that we see across commercial vehicle usage, I think those are often inherently linked to contractor working. So the problem with contractor working is that the company which is overseeing the operations, if they start intervening and telling someone how to do their job, then they are making them very clearly an employee, even though I'd argue that most of the time they are clearly employees anyway. But they're reinforcing that expectation, and they're more scared of having employees than they are of pretty much anything else, including, for example, having widespread illegal working on their platforms, including modern slavery. These are this sort of attachment to the gig economy is causing huge problems everywhere you look across our city, and I really think that that's at the heart of solving a lot of these problems without needing a specific framework, for example, for cargo bikes. Because, for example, if vans were branded and you could trace back to the company, and then the company had a responsibility for its employees' actions, then that would be a very sharp modifier of behaviour, and that's how we operate. We have very clearly branded bikes, branded hats. We have nameplates on the bikes, so we can trace if someone's behaving poorly on the road. Then we get that feedback, we're approachable, and then we do something about it, speak to the rider, and depending on the severity of what they've been doing, then either go to disciplinary measures or a more informal conversation, just saying, that's not how we do things here. I know you've come from somewhere else where, you know, jumping red lights is strongly encouraged. Here, we don't tolerate that. That's not how we do business. We're here to be a strong social contributor to the city. We're here to protect the city. We're here to help the city. And we need to look after our customers too, and we need to be fast, but we need to do it within the rules and in a fashion that's benefiting everyone around us.
Can I just come in on that point? So I think the other thing that's just a really sort of helpful way to think about it as well is that a cargo bike in itself is quite a broad definition. So you can go from an electrically assisted vehicle that is very much more like the sort of cargo bikes that might be used for, you know, micro consolidation, all the way down to, you know, your local resident who's bought a cargo bike and wants to use it for their shopping to Sainsbury's. So I think it's really important to bear that in mind as well, because depending on the types of businesses you are trying to encourage to use cargo bikes, regulation can then be more of a challenge versus less of a challenge. So, for example, if we look at some of the schemes that we've supported to kind of highlight the opportunity for maybe smaller local-led businesses to use cargo bikes, like, for example, there's a scheme called Our Bike that CRP have supported in a few boroughs, where essentially a local business hosts a cargo bike that then can be sort of used a bit like a Santander cycle by lots of other businesses in the area to just do their sort of small ad hoc deliveries. Now, if you apply a lot of regulation to that, you're then going to cause a huge barrier to these smaller businesses that are trying to be sustainable. But then when you come to the kind of larger scale, where you're wanting much larger businesses to procure, for example, a cargo bike courier or supplier to do a lot kind of bigger, bulkier delivery kind of, operations, then yes, they're going to want to be reassured that they're doing it safely, that they're doing it in a way that doesn't impact their own businesses, sort of credentials. So I think that's something that we really need to bear in mind, because a cargo bike can be a lot of different things to different people, and legislation and regulations in some instances are good, but in other instances could be quite negative.
Yes, so actually focusing it on that gig economy working model and getting a bit more safety into that would be a kind of more constructive way forward. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Assemblymember Russell. And it's back to Assemblymember Bakari. Assemblymember Bakari. Yeah, no, apologies. Yeah. Mike. Hina, Mike, sorry.
Focus. Waterborne freight. So there are barriers to increasing water freight, and the PLA have actually described quite a few of those issues. I'd like to just dig into that. So Fiona, I know that you may want to come in here, and so will you, Keith. Can you go through those barriers that they have? Some of it's to do with perception, some of it's to do with infrastructure and data gaps. What more is there that in terms of barriers for water?
I think one of the very key barriers is that cost competitiveness. There is a cost to everything, and if we can't make things competitive with road, it's just not going to happen. I'm sure Keith will come into detail on a lot more of these, but there's a general kind of the infrastructure improvements to make, for example, passenger versus freight conflicts less of a issue. So, for example, even looking at things like segregated freight kind of browse versus pedestrian browse. But then this is the problem. Who's going to pay for that? Who's going to actually put in the infrastructure that enables more river freight? Then there's things like the actual number of people and organisations associated with the river. As we've already touched on, piers are owned by different people. So how do you actually approach a kind of network for river freight if you're going to have to go through multiple different avenues to try and actually open up some of these opportunities? For example, similarly, there's things like lack of knowledge and understanding. We already know about, for example, how much the logistics industry doesn't like double handling, and like there's all these other kind of operational issues. And for example, we looked at one point around potentially doing some river freight near sort of South Bank, and the key thing that everyone said to us was, well, we have so much footfall, like how can we that's going to be an issue. But actually, when we did a bit of data analysis and monitoring, footfall is very low, comparatively low at different times of the day. So could we not then use, for example, that opportunity when usage is low from sort of pedestrians to actually put in river freight? And then there's things like we've already highlighted land use to support this. So I think there is a lot of barriers, but also a lot of opportunity. And there's a little bit of a struggle to know who should be responsible for trying to coordinate that. And that, I think, is in itself a challenge.
In regards to the costs to run the vessel, for example, from Dartford into central London, it's hugely expensive from an energy point of view. So when we're looking at going forward, we compare ourselves to rail in regards to some of the freight initiatives that are going on there and the subsidies that they receive. There's nothing available for us on river at the moment, and so part of the mode switch initiatives, we want to be involved in that to be able to have subsidies. The project that we're working on at the moment is part funded from the private business of Thames Clippers, as well as public money as well, and therefore there is a benefit for all for this to work and for it to be successful. The bit about the infrastructure as well. Yes, at the moment we're fitting a brand new service onto an existing passenger set up in operation, and therefore we have to be compliant to the restrictions that happen there. So again, from a brow point of view, the only ones that we can use are going to be wide enough to allow a cargo bike to travel up it at a safe speed being walked up there, with passengers walking down the other side, making sure there is safe integration between both services. Going forward, there is the desire to have dedicated freight piers. But again, that's a lot of investment required to do that. And we've got to prove the model. We've got to prove this first to get that further investment, whether it be public or private.
What more could the Mayor and TfL do to increase water freight in London?
I think supporting us with planning applications in regards to charging infrastructure, making it easier for us to get planning. So again, if we want to charge the vessel, chances are we're going to have to install a new substation near the water edge. That comes at huge cost to us as a private business. You know, for example, we're installing a battery barge, which has got 2 megawatt batteries on board. It's a huge amount of battery capacity there. That's to allow us to have a 45-minute charging time for our vessel. So it means that it's efficient in regards to the time comparisons of using road to move those items. So huge amount of investments required to do that. What would make our lives easier is being able to have a reduction in some of the restrictions on the planning along those lines. And I think it's going forward. It's difficult to say because, you know, ban all vehicles. That would be the best thing you could do. You know, ban all four-wheel vans in London and everything will go on the river. That'd be great, but that's not going to be feasible. So, you know, it's about actually, you know, we want to work alongside the existing transport and infrastructure that's there. We can complement what's going on the road and enhance what the likes of Pedal Me are doing, and actually bring new business into London that they can't currently do at the moment because of the stem mileage from distribution centre to the central zone. So I think it is about supporting us on the planning and supporting us on trying to get a reduction in our energy costs. That will mean that we're able to have electric vessels and more of them. We want to stay that way rather than go to a hybrid model because we want to keep it carbon free, but it also has to be sustainable from a business point of view as well. So the more subsidies we have on the power, the better.
I also wanted to dig in a little bit more about the Port of London Authority as well and their influence over the river. So they've submitted a harbour revision order in January 2024 with legislative changes to autonomous vessels. So how do you expect the autonomous vessels to change the nature of river freight, and have you got any concerns about the implementation about that?
I mean, it's not something that we've looked into as a business. We will need people operating our vessels, and so therefore, I'm not sure really whether there's been any work done by you guys on that, but not by us.
No, if I'm totally honest, the challenge of just getting river freight as a operational model is difficult, and bringing in autonomy, I think, will just add another whole complexity at this stage. We need to actually prove that the operational sort of viability of river freight is even possible at scale before we can start thinking about even more innovative ways, because I think that would just be a bit of a minefield, if I'm totally honest.
Did either of your groups actually feed into the inquiry? Because I know that a lot of residents in the local area have been quite concerned about river noise, cruise ships, there's charges to balconies, party boats, rigid inflatable boats, damage that this could cause for wildlife in the area. Have you raised any of those issues yourselves in terms of this area at all, either of your groups?
We haven't raised any issues, but we have done work to kind of look into some of those challenges, I guess. So, for example, we did do some monitoring on, for example, when we had a vessel that then became electrified, and we wanted to understand and quantify the impacts of that. And that obviously was a really useful way to actually provide a database as to some of the impacts that kind of encouraging more sustainable vessel operations would provide. So, for example, better air quality, not just for those, you know, in the area, but those on the vessels themselves, noise. So I think we probably, although we haven't responded, data is probably the best way to look into some of these challenges, and we're sort of trying to do that where we find appropriate funding, which could then obviously be supportive of, I guess, some of the concerns allayed from residents.
Does the Cross River Partnership actually have an opinion about the River Thames and how it's governed? You know, there's some argument to say that there needs to be some sort of change to make sure that there's a balance between public and commercial interests. Have you got an opinion on that?
If I'm totally honest, not particularly. We're an impartial organisation, so we're just, you know, our aim is basically to improve sustainability, well-being and health for Londoners generally. The Port of London Authority, we work with around those topics, but as an impartial organisation, we haven't really got a solid, strong viewpoint either way.
So, what was the question for me on that?
I have to say, I
Well,
think
it
we
doesn't
might be.
matter. I mean, I think
we're
we can probably
straying
move on.
out of the whole governance of the river is an entirely different meeting.
I was interested to know if there was
yeah.
any position, but
I'm sure you can ask them
there.
outside the meeting if necessary. Thank you, Assembly Member Turrell.
Thank you, Chair. We spoke a lot about infrastructure that's already existing across London. Now, one thing that's rather gone out of things that we've got a lot of left of is canals. Are they a relic of the past or untapped potential?
Well, from my point of view, so we concentrate on the river. The thing that we are able to provide is a comparable time for journey through the river. The canals are restricted in regards to the speed. Also, they could be slower because of locks, etc., and what have you. Now, saying that, we are in conversations with potential clients for like a partnership where they will be using the canals, and then we connect up to the river and what have you. But it certainly wouldn't be something that we as an organisation would be looking at, operating on canals at this time.
I think just on that, I would view it as untapped potential. I think the, as usual, issue is funding, how we actually address that challenge. And if I'm totally honest, I think the opportunities from the Thames and rail are probably slightly more significant. But what is very interesting is that there have been a lot of European funding calls that have actually wanted to address inland waterways, including canals. So I definitely think it's an area that more needs to be looked at, and potentially more research, more trials, but the way we operate is obviously based on kind of the funding we can bring in, and it hasn't been as popular a funding topic in the past few years, but hopefully that will change.
Thank you, and so sticking with you, Fiona, what is it you think that London could do to make better use of its king housing if you see them as untapped potential?
Well, I guess it's that integration with other modes. So, for example, as Keith's already highlighted, there's that connectivity. And, for example, canals often are in places that are quite hard to access by road. So I think that's where the potential lies. It's how we can integrate it into the actual logistics sort of system in a way that is effective and sustainable. So I think that's basically the opportunity. But as I said, it would be great if we could get some funding to trial some things, because then we'll know if it's actually viable.
Thanks. And just to say that we did want to try to get somebody specifically who could talk in detail about canals. They weren't able to get anyone, but we will be seeking specific evidence from them. If there are people listening out there who care about canals, don't worry. And so, Assembly Member Garrett. OK, that's fine. Assembly Member, yeah, absolutely. Assembly Member Prince.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, panel. What capacity do we think there is for rail freight on passenger trains in London?
So this is a really interesting one. I think there's, in terms of rail freight, there's parcels as passengers. That would be the opportunity to kind of integrate more freight into passenger trains. I think what's really interesting is we are all kind of aware that there are peaks, sort of times in the rail sort of passenger services that trains are underutilised. There has been a few trials that have looked at parcels as passengers, but I think what is difficult about that service is it's very expensive in the sense of the kind of models that seem to operate best are where you have an individual who, for example, then takes those deliveries and and then goes in sort of, through walking freight or other means. So it's all about the scalability. There's opportunity because we know that, if a passenger service has a lack of passengers, you could, for example, close off a whole carriage, put in, for example, roll cages. And I know that, for example, Connected Places Catapult and some of the innovation grants that they've been doing have actually looked into the mechanism in order to do that. But again, it's sort of the scalability question. It's possible. And I know, as I said, that trials have been done, but is it cost effective for an operator to do? Probably not at this stage. So yes, it's definitely an opportunity there. But again, I think it's another area where more research, more trials need to be done in order to see if it would work as a viable, at-scale operational model.
Thank you. Did anyone else want to add to that? Could you get your bikes on the trains, do you think, Ben? Well, by the way, Ben, a year or so, no more than a couple of years ago, I actually spent a day using your service. It was brilliant until it started to rain and I got drowned.
Yeah, it's on my list of things to fix, is better bikes for carrying people and better weather protection. But yeah, we're focused on deliveries at the minute. Yeah, I mean, we've done a couple of operations combining with rail freight. There was a company called Pesky Fish. They were sending in fish from the West Country by train to Paddington. We were able to take our bikes down onto the platform, load them there. It was incredibly efficient. Unfortunately, the types of the high-speed trains changed, and they had less storage space on them. So that project sadly had to go to van being driven down from the West Country, which was... and yeah, I think it, as in common with some of the other conversations we've had, it's all about the economics and creating the economic framework which encourages people to look for other ways, because there are economic drivers that are pushing in that direction. So it's all about kind of trying to make sure that we're charging appropriately for motor vehicle use in one way or another, whether that's in time or in congestion charging and other mechanisms for rebalancing the sort of externalities of motor vehicle use, the impact that that motor vehicle use has on all of us in London, and that's kind of a real powerful tool you have at your disposal to drive changes in behaviour, to help encourage people to find better ways and to make those better ways more economically favourable in their early stages, where, like with solar panels, with wind farms, that needed a huge push to start off with, because those technologies didn't have the scale, and there are many other equivalent technologies, cargo bikes being one, where these industries are really in their infancy. I mean, if I look at the cargo bikes we see in operation today, I think over the next 20 years, we could see cargo bikes which have 50% more carrying capacity, that are half the weight, that have much greater range. And if you look at the range of industries that are there to support motor vehicle logistics, like in the manufacture of a single van, there may be 1,000 companies involved in manufacturing the components that make that van. And then you look at the tech offerings that are available to van logistics, where like the routing's all taken care of and you can just get it off the shelf very cheaply. We've had to develop our own technology to allow us to do that. We've had to develop our own bikes to allow us to do what we do. We've had to develop our own like maintenance systems, and all of this requires more expenditure than would be the case with like once it's an incumbent industry in 20 years' time. And I can see like absolutely huge changes coming for cargo bikes, but for a whole range of other sectors, if we create the right framework that allows the advantage of the incumbent industries, the incumbent way of doing things, to be disrupted by balancing for the costs. Sorry.
If there was some kind of modulation, so you could just, like they do on aircraft, they have like modules that go on. If you get a module that go on the train and then slot straight into a cargo bike and off and away.
Yeah, I mean, there's a startup called Varamis rail. I think they're running...
I think it's Edinburgh to Liverpool Street.
There's a startup that is doing broadly this. So they've taken on some old passenger stock and converted it. I'm not sure how much traction they've got and how far they've gone. Maybe Fiona, you know more.
Yeah, I guess this is where it's really interesting because that's not technically a parcels as passenger service either. That's like converting a passenger carriage to become a dedicated express freight service. In terms of the traction, I'm not aware. I remember I went to their launch event, which was very interesting, and it's amazing to see, I think it was flagged earlier, just how much space that those sort of trains can take in terms of capacity from LGVs and HGVs. But again, it's just to kind of clarify, that is probably the most opportune system. Parcels as passengers is a lot more tricky because of, for example, we know that there's a lot of, you have to be out of the station within a certain time. So you're kind of looking at an end-to-end destination because you just couldn't unload in those sort of middle stations. So that probably is the most useful example, the Varamis, and that's what we would be trying to do at Waterloo as well, a dedicated freight train rather than parcels as passengers.
I think the only thing on that, when talking about what you see on trains in regards to the containers, whether there's something in the future about some kind of uniformed loading containers for cargo bikes. I don't know how you get an industry to come together on that, but similar to how containers are for the shipping industry, that kind of thing, to be able to then have that, and that means that you're able to, from our point of view on the boat, you could use that, but also for trains as well, and then you actually build an operation and a model around that, which makes it more efficient for everybody involved.
Thanks very much. And those are all our questions. So thanks very much for being with us today. If there is anything that you then go, oh, we really should have told you this, then please do feel free to send that in. We do want to hear what you've got to say. But thank you very much to all our guests for your responses today. You're now free to leave, although it will only be another couple of seconds. So can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion? Can we also delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output arising from the meeting? Yep. Can I ask the committee to note its work programme and meeting dates? The next meeting of the committee is scheduled for the 9th of December 2025 at 10 a.m. in the chamber at City Hall. There is no urgent business. Thank you. The meeting is now closed.